Fantastic. Okay. Thank you, Sanjini, and thank you everyone for joining. Can you please introduce yourself so that we all can know you better?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Good morning. I hope everyone's gotten fresh and is ready for the session. So first, I'd like to give a brief about myself. So presently, I'm working at KPMG as an ESG consultant. Before that, I have about 4 years of experience where in different roles, I've been working across the nonprofit sector. I have worked across a different ESG consultancy. Over there, my work was primarily around financial institutions itself. But as my background, I am a finance graduate, so I do not really come from sustainability or environment as a field. So I joined my first job, and over there I got exposure to what ESG is or how sustainability actually interlinks with maybe corporates or again the non-profit sector or the finance, the VCs and the Ps and such. So I guess that is the part I brought from my finance background, but what I lacked was in the form of actually understanding the business case for sustainability, or why is there such a rush around the environment as a topic in the in the financial industry, right? So that is why maybe if I could go across this, so this would help me in two fronts. The first would be I would learn for myself.
Is there a noise glitch? Stuti, can you hear?
Am I audible?
Yeah, I think there was a breakout, but okay, no problem.
Okay, sure. So I just wanted to share my motivation behind taking the exam. I believe there are a lot of people here who have not yet signed up for the exam or are like considering whether I should not. So it's good to have a sense of the different perspectives from which people go around to take the exam. There are a lot of people. So during the course of this exam itself, so I gave this exam in April 22. I passed this exam in April 22. And during the course of that, if you go across LinkedIn, you'll find a lot of groups where it's like SCR preparation group or the likes of such. I think even Pratiksha posted about this course on one such group. So over there, even I came across a learning group over there, and this group was like literally all around the world. So there were like real experienced people who had like 20 odd years of experience. We sat together, we used to go through the chapter together, we used to make mock exams for ourselves and then run through it. So I guess the one of the best outcome that I had from this exam personally was the network that I could create around it. So like even till date, right, if I find someone that they have done the SCR exam, that is like such a quick way to go and approach them. Hey, even I'm an SCR certified person, I wanted to talk to you about XYZ. Or even if you're like a candidate right now, just hitting up anyone would give you a really good experience. You could talk to them about their work life. So you get people from a variety of backgrounds. So you will have people who have like 20 years of experience in ESG or climate itself, or there will be absolute freshers who just want to get into the field, and that's why they are doing this exam. So if anyone has any kind of questions, doubts, or anything about the motivation behind giving the exam, I'd be very happy to talk. Maybe not right now, but like after the session, or you could just hit me up on LinkedIn or something. I'd be very happy to discuss it further with you. So going ahead, uh, we could start with chapter 3 right now. So I'll give you a brief about the chapter first. So it's called climate change risk. So I would really love it if there would be more people who would come up and we could have a discussion rather than just me talking for 3 hours. So I would just like to get a quick sense of the people on the call here, and what do you understand by climate change risk, or when you see it, what do you think the chapter could possibly talk about? I know there's a chapter content given in front. You don't need to worry about the jargons which are present, but in general, what do you think climate change risk is talking about here?
Hi, Sanjini. This is Aditya. I hope
Yeah.
I'm
Hi,
audible.
Aditya.
Yeah. Basically, the climate change risk from this exam perspective, I would say it's mostly about how climate will have impacts on the sustainability of the corporates, as well as like that's the major sense I'm getting from it. Apart from that, climate it's not only about the physical risk or the sea level rise, but it's going to affect supply chains, it's going to affect the financial statements.
Right.
So I think it's a combination of both of it. Yeah.
Absolutely.
And it's also about the journey and the transition.
I think we are establishing the linkages between the traditional financial risk to the climate change.
Right, absolutely right, Chandan. That is exactly what this chapter is about. Aditya, you were right too, but I think what you mentioned was more broad. So what you mentioned could be covered as in what the entire book talks about, but what Chandan talked about is the financial risk. So over here, climate change, so as the book itself mentions, right, like always keep in mind when you're taking this exam, GARP by itself is a financial risk institution. What they care about the most is how are all these interlinkages creating some kind of effect on your financial statements at the end of the day. Financial risk, financial statement, finance is the keyword in everything that you do in this exam. So even over here, climate change risk, it will be majorly talk about how is climate change affecting your financial statements. It's not that you're going to read financial statements or you're going to have some kind of calculations or something. That's not it. It's just about how is it affecting your finances. So it could be in the form of balance sheets, but then where does the balance sheet come from, right? Where is the revenue coming from? It is coming from your supply chain. It is coming from whatever you're selling, so on and so forth. So yes, finance is coming from a lot of things. It's an interlinkage. You have people, you have the products that you're selling, you again have your supply chain. It affects everything. But then this specific climate change risk that we'll talk about in this chapter is about how it has an interlinkage with finance. So going ahead, you can see over here the chapter content. So over here, 3.1 introduction to climate risk is exactly that. It will explain how they are focused. So when they say climate risk, they are talking about finance, climate risk on finance. That is exactly what it talks about. Then 3.2 is types of climate risk. That is what is expanded upon on 3.3, 3.4, 3.5, and so forth. And 3.6 transmission into finance and key sectors. Over here, they will talk a bit about just transitions, which we'll see what it is as time comes. Pratiksha, could you move to the next slide?
Yeah.
Yeah. Over here, then we have the learning objectives. So few things to clarify. Perform better in your exam. So the learning objectives, because this is present in every chapter right as the chapter starts. This will be am I audible enough? It's showing that internet is unstable.
Yeah, now better.
Yeah, it is.
I'm audible. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So the learning objectives becomes very important because these are the objectives by which the questions themselves are drafted for each exam. So the best we consider the learning objective before every chapter as a holy grail. You read through the entire material twice, thrice, however times you need it, and then you go back to the learning objectives and check if you can actually speak to yourself for about a minute on each of these learning objectives. So that is how you know, yes, you know the chapter very well. So over here also, if you run through the learning objectives, again, as a tip, the learning objectives are how the questions for the entire SCR exam is created. So they will literally ask you to frame the questions as per each of the questions should meet one of the learning objectives. So that is why this becomes so important. So the first thing that we have is describe how climate risk can translate to financial risk, what I mentioned before, physical and transition risk, then the hazards and drivers. So hazards and drivers, of course, we'll talk about it in detail later, but it's just about what are the causes of these risks. Stranded asset is kind of like an effect of these risks. Again, we'll talk about it later. Acute and chronic hazard with examples. Describe uncertainty, variability, and accuracy in hazard model predictions. Identify data challenges, modeling direct physical risk. Understand the current state of climate hazard data availability. So this I won't read through the entirety of it. I'm pretty sure you can read it yourself from there. But the crux of this entire thing, it covers a bunch of things. The first is how do you even classify these risks, right? If you can't classify them, you cannot calculate them, and you cannot track them, measure them, that entire journey that comes in sustainability. Then you have the data crunch, right? So everything in sustainability will have, at least at this point of time, will have a certain section of data crunch that comes in. Where do you get the data from? If you get it, how do you process it? If you do process it, how do you understand it? How do you show it? How do you convince the top management? So on and so forth. This chapter will talk about most of these factors. And then one of my favorite parts is the last point, which talks about the transition risk. And over here, they'll talk about just transitions, which is, okay, we need to move forward to more doing things more in a more clean manner, in a more green manner. Great. But what about the things that already exist, the infrastructure, the people who are trained to it? How do you transition them in a way that they don't lose their jobs, or there is not a huge amount of financial or whatever kind of loss, right? So that is an overview of the chapter. And if anyone has any questions or has anything specific they would like me to cover, you want me to go slower, you want me to go faster, please do mention it and I can start with the chapter.
Hey, we can start.
We can start off. Perfect. Yes. So again, 3.1, Introduction to Climate Risk. So this part, what it basically talks about is this, again, as I mentioned, as GARP mentioned, so climate risk, you can consider it as an abbreviated or a shortened version of saying climate-related financial risks. So when I say climate-related financial risk, what it essentially means is how it affects financial balance sheets and leads to losses through standard channels such as diminished asset valuations or increased loan defaults. So always keep in mind the various financial institutions that are at play when it comes to sustainability or climate change. So the entire objective, I would say over here, is to make people act right through the leash of money. That is what this entire thing is talking about. So when I say leash of money, who all are holding these leashes? So there will be two kinds, right? So one would be, there are people who wants to invest in a company. So these would become your PEs and VCs, private equities and venture capitalists. So they will go and say, I want to put some money into you, but you better get this thing right. So it could be anything, right? Like getting your human capital, having policies in place, X number of things. When it comes to climate specifically, it could talk about decarbonizing your supply chain, things like that. And the other end of the same spectrum would be when you, as a company or as an individual or whatever, have taken a loan, right? That these are the two channels by which any entity would possibly get money from. The second channel would be the loan from get money from a financial institution. And even in the case of a loan, it would come up, for example, if you not the case right now, but just as an assumption, say there's some kind of a mandate that you can only run EVs, ICs or petrol or diesel kind of things are not allowed anymore. What would you do? Your entire supply chain would come to a halt, which would mean that you can no longer sell products, which would mean that you cannot repay your loans. So that becomes a risk to the bank who has lended you that money. So that becomes a climate risk for that person, for the bank itself. So these are the two ends of the spectrum. And that is what climate risk over here would specifically talk about. As you see forward, so there are a lot of, you see a lot of net zero goals coming up, right? So the most popular one, at least the one which coincides the most, are that most governments, countries, companies want to go net zero by 2050. So I just wanted to get a sense of if everyone actually understands what net zero is. Or if you don't, you could just pop in on chat, raise a hand, something. I know it's too early in the morning for a Sunday. I do am I'm sitting with my coffee. Sorry.
Go ahead. We understood net zero concept there.
Yeah,
Sorry.
go ahead.
So I think it's the emission should be 0 till 2050.
Understood. So the thing is, emission can never be 0. We still live in an industrial capitalist society, so emission can never be 0. But what it plans on doing is making it net zero. So there might be, so you're increasing your emissions in some way, but in some way you're also decreasing it. So the net becomes a 0.
I think stabilizing the emission.
Right, stabilizing would be, yes, maybe you could call it that. But yeah, that's what it is. So you go ahead and so on an individual level, right? So today I decide to go to Juhu. I go and drive my car to Juhu. but there is an X amount of emission which has been created there, right? So to offset that, I might go and plant, say, 10 trees. Does not work like that, but just as an example. So then I can go and claim to say that my journey to Juhu has been net zero. Okay, there are some things in the chart. Let me just see it. Reduction by 90% to basic. Carbon neutrality is different than net zero. Yes, definitely. Carbon neutrality is different.
So
Offset and capital, right.
it will be never be net zero then till we stop our consumption, right? Consumption
Sorry?
is more, so
Understood.
it will be never net zero if we don't stop our consumption.
So what the scenario that you
Consumption
are
is
talking
increasing.
about, yes, understood, Someshwar. So the situation or the situation you're talking about is where there are no emissions. Please keep it in mind, no emissions is not zero emission or net zero. So no emission is never the target here. No emission is not possible, right? As a whole, as
Agree.
right?
Agree. Yes.
Yeah. So consumption can never be zero. Hi, Natasha, you have a question.
Yeah, I think just to add on, I think this is why a lot of governments are focusing on carbon capture and carbon reduction, right? To get the negative emissions. But is that something that's actually feasible? Because you have to do it on such a large scale.
Right. So there are, of course, there's a lot of studies and a lot of things which happen. So even right now, when you're working on things like decarbonization strategies and so there's a lot of tech interplay. But yeah, there are a lot of questions on it too. Like, for example, if you talk about, I'm not sure if it was covered yesterday, but there are ways mentioned of how you can actually reduce your emissions. So again, remember, we are not really reducing emissions in this. What we are just doing is we are doing business as usual. We are emitting, but what we are doing is we are also taking initiatives to ensure that at least from somewhere some emission gets reduced, or like it gets captured, as you mentioned. Yes. Hi, Astha.
Hi, Sanjini. I would just like to add one point here. So, net zero, there are two types of net zero. One is SBTI approved net zero, which is the gold standard in the industry. And one is net zero that companies and corporation take, but they don't have any backing on it. They don't have it as per any standard. So, there is a company, very big company, who has taken a net zero, but they are not science-based targets approved. Okay. So they are not liable to go to anyone and show their performance. They can say, but most companies, most investors currently look for science-based target, and science-based targets talk about if you are signing for net zero, then you should reduce your emissions by 90%, as I said, to absolute reduction. So, for example, if my emission today is 1,000, then by whatever year I see it become net zero or 90%, it should be 100. That's how it is. They want to look at it, and rest 10% we can offset. So that would be actual net zero. SBTI is one of the best
No, so
agency.
yeah, so but the problem is, do you really quantify this?
Yes.
Like,
so I am currently preparing a net zero roadmap for my organization. So we are really relying on the value chain to become green. So, for example, my employees coming to office, I believe that there 35, there will be no C engines and C engine vehicles in the market. I even target suppliers that you go take this target. So in my calculation, after 35, after reducing my scope 1 and scope 2 by 90%, I am saying that given the entire industry changes to decarbonization pathway, it will be reduced. So that's how we are going by that. The entire industry shifting to a lesser fuel emission pathway, like the pathway yesterday we talked about, right? That way.
and as per your report, only CO2 is responsible for all the hazardous.
No.
So is talking about the all GSA.
Yes.
So all GSA emissions is associated with the net zero.
It is tons equivalent. It's not only. So time equivalent means we calculate for all the relevant emission. We calculate it based on GHG protocol.
So Astha, the 90% reduction is only for scope 1 and 2, or is it for emissions as a whole?
So it depends on the industry. So as per SBTI, if your scope 3 emission is more than 40% of your entire inventory, then you have to take scope 3 target, which is true for 90% of the companies. So they have to take, and any company that is only taking scope 1 and scope 2 target is sort of greenwashing.
Right.
Yeah.
Agreed. Thanks, Astha. That was really good. Insightful. I didn't know that. Thank you. Yeah. So I think that clears up a little bit about what net zero targets are. So just going forward, so most of these countries, companies, as Astha mentioned, have taken up these net zero goals, and it says to reach those goals by 2050, right? But the question from this that arises are, who are the people who are really responsible for reaching this net zero? A country today goes and declares that we'll become net zero. So there are a lot of things at play, right? Emissions are created at an individual level, at a company level, so like a private corporation level, at a government level. So who exactly is taking the responsibility on it, and who is really responsible to act on it? So that's what we'll discuss about here. So that's the thing, like who should bear the cost of it, more importantly. So over here it comes up, so to align all of this, that is when the TCFD framework came into play. So as it's mentioned over there, it was formed in 2015 in the G20 Financial Stability Board. So the TCFD, again, it talks about climate risk, but from a financial point of view. So it will ask you to categorize all your risks, put it into one place, and it will enable everyone, so anyone who is viewing a TCFD report, to understand where are these little nicks and picks where related to climate risk, where your finances are getting impacted. So over here, you can see that so the differentiation of climate risk, which is into physical and transition risk, was actually coined by TCFD themselves. So we'll talk about what are these two risks specifically. Before that, you can just have a look at the next bullet point, which says that viewing climate through a risk lens means zeroing in specifically on the ways in which climate change affects assets through hazards and drivers, exposures, and vulnerabilities. So again, over here, since you can look at it, so when I keep harping on the fact that this is from a finance point of view, so as they mentioned, they are looking at things about how it's affecting our assets, but at the end of the day, yes, they affect our balance sheet, but also you should keep in mind that you can have a very black and white one-dimensional thing about, yes, it's affecting a balance sheet, but then it's also affecting your sustainability strategy as a whole. Because for example, when you say asset for a company, what would it be? It could possibly be a warehouse, it could be some kind of factories, it could be your stores, shops, whatever. If one of these things are getting closed, your business is also getting affected, right? Or like if you have to think about, there are hundreds of people getting laid off if, say, a warehouse closes due to one of such risk. So there are thousands of people getting laid off. So there are a lot of social repercussions to these things itself. So it might not be right to always keep thinking just about financials, but the financial is a very good, you could say, a barometer to understand how is this affecting everything else which surrounds this ecosystem. So going forward, you can see that how they transmit into the real financial economy. So yes, economies would be the better word to look through it. So how are they affecting the economies on a household level, to the company level, to, of course, back to governments and nations, and the financial institution that lend to and invest in them, and how different sectors are differently affected. So over here, there will be some case studies about different sectors. So like something as the oil and gas industry would be affected very differently to something as, say, a small startup based in Bangalore, right? So that's what we look into. This is not what they talk about, but like, yeah, that's an example. So then we can move on to types of climate risk. Diksha, you could move to the next.
Yeah. I am trying.
No problem. Okay.
Things are not moving. Is it moving now?
I don't see it. I see that I think some markings made on it.
I don't know. It's not stop. I'm not able to stop this.
Maybe you could just stop your screen sharing, reload the page.
Got it. No,
Yeah.
I figured it. I figured
Perfect.
it.
So before we do move on to the next slide, I just would like to know if there are any questions, anything. Okay. Okay.
No.
Astha, so
I
much.
have I have a question, but it's not related to this chapter, but really I'm confused, right? So now we are talking about all the carbon dioxide only, right? CO2 emissions, the
Not
CO,
really.
2030. Now, if I read in atmosphere,
We're not
there
talking
is
about just CO2. So when I say emissions, so we are talking about greenhouse gas emissions as a whole. We are not talking just about CO2.
no,
So
so
what you see are, yeah, what you see,
2030 target is there, carbon neutrality.
yes.
So like if I check, all the rules are based on particularly CO2. I know methane is also there, but main gas which everybody is target is CO2. And in atmosphere, it is 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, and 1% is multiple gases. Out of that, only 0.4% is carbon dioxide. So, do you know why we are targeting only carbon dioxide? How much impact it is going to make? 0.4%, and on that 0.4%, only 10 to 15% human are responsible. So, do you think we are going to make an impact?
So the
Like
other
it's a
gas
yeah. I'm confused. I'm a little. That's why I'm asking this question.
yeah,
Maybe
that's
it's not
absolutely all
relevant.
right. So the
Not
other
relevant to
gases
this
that
chapter.
you mention in the atmosphere are not really greenhouse gases, right? So again, if you have to look at the definition of what a greenhouse gas is something that captures heat inside the atmosphere. Oxygen does not capture heat. It does
No.
not.
I totally understand. But we
Yeah.
are working on just 0.4% gas.
I'm not sure where you're getting that conclusion from, but we are not talking about that. We don't look at the atmosphere and quantify it and say, okay, so 1/4 gas humko kam karna hai. That's not what's happening. What we are bothered about is what are we emitting? What is naturally present, good for them, let them exist, right? What we are bothered about is what is the human contribution to those gases. So if you say whatever the percentages that you mentioned, I'm not aware of them, but in between them, if you have to say that you can't emit oxygen, right? You will, as a production level, you will only emit carbon related gases, right? I'm not saying carbon dioxide, but yeah.
Maybe I'll add on to
Yeah,
the
sure.
answer. Yeah, sure. So, see, the global warming is linked to the greenhouse gases, right? So the greenhouse gases is less than 1%. Like you're saying, the CO2 is 0.3 and all. So CO2 has already been our atmospheres naturally. But the problem is, like past 200 years, because of the anthropogenic reasons, CO2 has been drastically increasing. Now, like why we are converting everything in terms of CO2 is that, like rest of all the other six GHGs, they are very short-lived. Although their global warming potential is very high, like methane is 28 and all, and like they are halocarbons with over 1,000 of green water, but they are very short-lived. So what makes CO2 important is the half-life of CO2 is very high, right? And it sustains in environment for a long time. That is why it is a concern. And also CO2 marks as an indicator. So it's easier for us to have kind of sort of indicator to represent collectively for a GHG. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense actually, because I agree CO2 stays in the atmosphere for long compared to other gases.
A
Thank you.
lot of IPCC reports talk about the cumulative emission, not the current flow. If you talk about the cumulative, that is carbon presence is the more than 500 years. So it's a very substantial to consider it carbon dioxide gas.
Yeah. So I think we can move on to the types of climate risk which are present. So over here, as you can see, so on a very broad level, so the middle row over here, right? Climate risk, hazards, drivers, exposures. You could go back to that. I think I can explain from that and we can come back to this. It gives a better overview.
Oh, okay. I'm not sure why this is happening, but yeah.
Yeah. So climate risk, hazards and drivers, exposures and vulnerabilities. So consider this entire middle row as a chain of cause and effects, and what are we exactly calling these things? So the first thing that we have here is the climate risk itself. So climate risk, according to TCFD, is divided into two parts: physical risk and transition risk. So let's talk about physical risk first. So when you hear the term physical risk, right? So that is literally it, the physical risk that climate creates, in the sense that the assets that you have, how is climate affecting your assets, physically present assets? So again, it could be warehouses, factories, shops, any kind of office buildings, establishments, anything. So over there, if you have, say you have some kind of a weather event, like there's a tornado or something, it comes up, it destroys your building. So that is you being affected by physical climate risk. Similarly, if you have to talk about transition risk is about more from a policy mindset, I would say. Not just policy, but in the sense that it talks about you are taking XYZ measures to take care of climate risk. So there are some kind of afterlying effects to it, right? So as I mentioned towards the beginning, if anyone remembers, it's about saying you want to phase out ICEs. But there is a very, very big industry which revolves around this making of these engines, right? Or making of these normal petrol, diesel vehicles. So what happens to that entire asset base, the people working on it, everything? So that is your transition risk. So say again, in some X days, someone comes and says that all coal plants are going to be phased out. So you have a very big establishment that you can do nothing with. So that particular coal plant would be facing a transition risk. So transition risk, you can consider it to be a little futuristic in nature, that yes, some kind of policies or maybe even customer sentiments could sway in a way that I can no longer use these things. That is transition risk. And even physical risk is futuristic, but it's more in a way that it will just get destroyed. So over here, if you see, physical risk again gets divided into two types: acute and chronic. So these are the hazards and drivers. If you have to simplify it, it's just the causes of it. So you will have like what is causing these kind of physical and transition risks. So if you have to look at the top over here, acute weather hazards. So the acute ones, if you have, is the climate events itself. So you will have things like floods, cyclones, and droughts. So if any of these events come up, so for example, you have a farmland, a drought comes up, your produce is gone, right? So that means you have been hit by an acute weather hazard. Chronic, on the other hand, is more longer. It's towards from a longer period of time. So over here you have things like sea level rise, heat, water stress, etc. So this doesn't happen overnight. Your drought or like a flood or something, a cyclone could come overnight. This won't come overnight. So that's why it's chronic, right? So you can see indications of it day by day, but that does not just show up in a day. So those are your chronic weather hazards. Then when it comes to transition risk, you have, these are the things which will basically lead to transition risk. So you have policy changes, you have technological changes, and consumer pressure. So these are things that we talked about when I was explaining transition risk too. So you point one, like you could have policy changes like coal shutdowns, carbon taxes. Of course, it will affect how these elements are getting interplayed, right? Next, you have technological changes, for example, cheaper renewables, even right now. So you might have cheaper alternatives, so more expensive, maybe what is BAU for us right now might get shut down. So that is again a transition risk for you. So like things are transitioning, but the transition itself is possessing a risk for you. And then you have customer pressure, consumer pressure. So again, customer sentiments might sway. They do not want to engage in things which are more, say, plastic oriented, carbon oriented, so on and so forth. So these would be the hazards and drivers when it comes to transition risk. Then you have the exposures. So exposures are, so if you look at it, so it can be of two types: facility level and corporate level. So exposure is again, if there are people who come here from a finance background, they would gain it. So you basically expose yourself to a risk, right? You might be aware of it, but you still expose yourself to a certain amount of risk to get a certain amount of return. So higher risk, higher return, that kind of a logic. but that of course does not apply to physical and transition risk. But the exposure is literally, it's a financial term itself, which has been interplayed here into climate related events. So over here, it's just talking about, for example, if you create a building which is known to be a cyclone prone area, you have exposed yourself to that risk very, you were aware of it, kind of a way. So that is what your exposure is. So if we just read into this here, so on a facility level, anything in a hazard zone, so infrastructure, residential property, commercial facilities. And then on a corporate level, it might affect your supply chain, or again with any kind of facilities that you have. So it's just about knowing your where your facilities are situated. Again, on a transition risk level, it's again the same thing. It could be on a facility or a corporate level. And then you have the emissions, assets, fossil fuels, IC vehicles, so on and so forth. And then on a corporate level, you'll have firms with business operations dependent on emissions. So if you have some kind of business operations which is dependent on like it does emit a lot, right? But you cannot emit that much. So you just need to reduce it in very simplistic terms. So that becomes a transition risk, exposure for your transition risk. And vulnerability. So the vulnerability part basically talks about your tenacity to endure it, endure the risk which is arising from these things. So again, over here, both of these, as you can see, are divided into facility level and corporate level. So when I say tenacity, I could possibly take an example of, say, ITC, right? ITC known to be one of the most sustainable brands, even though majority of the revenue comes from tobacco. So if tomorrow, so we can, it's not necessarily a climate risk, but it's just easy to understand, I believe. So you can just go through this entire value chain, which is right from climate risk to vulnerability with this example. So maybe not climate risk, but some risk. So you are producing, could you go back? Yeah, thank you. So you are producing tobacco. What's your exposure is the fact that you're producing tobacco itself it's a big social, it's considered to be a social evil, right? So you are exposed in those fronts. But then what would your vulnerability or tenacity to endure it be? So say a government comes up and says that you cannot like tobacco sale is banned. What happens then? But ITC being as big as it is, it might have lobbying powers, it might have 100, it has like, of course, it has other channels that it does business into. So that vulnerability or the tenacity to bear the brunt of that risk is different for different kind of industries and companies. So that is what vulnerability talks about here. So over here you have, so on a facility level, so coming back to just talking about climate, you can have on a facility level, if you have something which is situated on a coastal area. So you could have flood pumps, fire breaks, so on and so forth. So even if something does come up, you have some kind of infrastructure present there to protect yourself from it. So yeah, you could call it that too. So vulnerability is basically your capacity to protect yourself from those risks. On a corporate level, you could have contingency plans, access to insurance. Then again, when it comes to transition risk, on a facility level, you have extent of ability to decarbonize. So you will have people converting to biomass or hydrogen-based energies. And on a corporate level, you will have the transition plans. So yeah, we will move on to the next slide. So this was on a very overview level. So over here, things are in a detailed manner. So I think you could just run through it quickly enough. So it is physical risk. We could go back there. Yeah, I'll just read through it once. Yeah. So it is divided into two broad categories: physical risk, transition risk. So I think it would be, instead of me repeating the same thing, it would be fun if anyone could just volunteer and explain to the bunch, what did you understand by physical risk? And then we could do the same for transition risk. Anyone wants to give it a shot? What is your understanding of
Take a
physical
shot
risk?
at it.
Yeah.
So just a way to think of it, climate risk. When you talk of climate risk, immediately you think of what kind of risk the climate can pose, and when you think of it, the first thing that comes to mind is earthquakes, floods, and other things.
Right.
And the moment you think of floods, earthquakes, and other things, the first risk that should pop up is physical, because it is all more physical in nature. So some more of a mental model you create, physical risk related to floods, earthquakes, wildfires, heat waves. So these are like not in our control, in the sense that it happens because of the nature itself. So it is more physical in nature. But because of the physical risk, we have to make some changes in our lifestyle. That means we have to transition. And
Right.
when we have to transition, it causes a transition risk because we have to change our behavior. And hence the second type of risk, which is transition risk. Now, when we talk about physical risk, it is broken up into two parts. Because the climate is not static in nature, it can have like sudden changes, or it can have a gradual changes. Sudden changes are more acute, like, you suddenly someone getting a heart attack. That is like more acute, so that's how I remember it. And chronic is like a chronic illness, something we have like over a period of time, right? So you can make it a mental model that physical risk can be either sudden, which is acute, or which is over a period of time, which is chronic. And then transition risk is the second part of it, how we translate into different structures. So that's how I basically map it out in my mind.
Perfect, Prashant. I think that's really useful. Acute could be your heart attacks and chronic could be your diabetes. So yeah. Okay, we can move forward. Yeah. Exposures and vulnerabilities. So again, exposures are basically the causes of each one of these things, each one of these risks. So if we have to just read through it, exposure here is used in the classic financial sense of assets or firms that are in a vulnerable place or setting. So you kind of are aware of what's happening. It's not that you set yourself up even after knowing, but like, yeah, you are just aware of your exposure to it and you act accordingly. And vulnerability again means is your capacity to take the risk which comes. So can also be discussed at the facility level or transition risk, referring to the ease of reducing or eliminating emissions, for instance, through conversion to hydrogen-based production. Okay, that is an example. Yeah, I think this point talks about it, the third point. Vulnerability, a concept linked to notions of resilience, flexibility, and adaptation, is less of a focus in traditional financial risk, but it is integral to consideration of climate risk, especially physical climate risk. It refers to the propensity or predisposition of the asset or firm to suffer adversely from its exposure to hazards. So in case any of these things come up, what do you have in place to ensure that your impact to it is reduced or like even nullified if possible? Yeah, I think we can move forward. Pratiksha, you can move to the next slide. Some questions. Hi, Aditya, I see a question here that there are other transition risks as well, like legal and reputation. No, they do cover all of it. So that snapshot that you saw, they just picked few maybe, but they do cover all of it. And yeah, you of course have to just stick to the book, but never hurts to know more. But the book does cover legal and reputational risk. Also, what is this? Those are types of transition risk defined by TCFD needed to remember for exam. But you don't need to, they will question your legal and reputational also.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant was that just like how physical risk is acute and chronic, the transition risk type are policy and legal, technology, market, and reputational. So those are
Right.
4 types of transition risk.
Right,
So
they do cover all of that.
They are all covered as part of
yeah.
it.
Yeah, I think Pratiksha is back.
Hey guys, can you see my screen?
Yeah, it's visible.
Yeah, that market risk and legal risk is there, right? In the
It's all.
the chapter. Yeah.
So could you just move to the next slide?
Is this covered already?
Just go back. Let me just see.
Yeah, sure. Okay, we are at standard assets.
Yeah, we covered stranded assets, right? Okay, so stranded assets, again, I think the term itself is very accurate in the sense it just talks about what is stranded. It just can't do anything about it. You have a stranded asset is as good as an asset that you have lost. So a stranded asset mostly comes from is a result of transition risk. So what it does is, again, if you have to take an example of coal plants, a government or some kind of nation comes and says that you can no longer use coal energy, right? So you have this entire facility built and functioning, and one day it just stops. And you can't do anything else with it, right? So like a coal plant you could repurpose it, but that's again a game of like millions and millions of dollars to reconstruct things inside. But the asset as it is as whole, you can't do anything with it. So that is what it is. It's a stranded asset, and you will possibly have to write it off your balance sheets because it is no longer giving you any kind of financial gains. So it's not generating any revenue for you. You cannot possibly sell it off to someone. Even for a loss, you just can't sell it off because no one will buy it. So yeah, so an asset which will possibly give you no kind of financial returns will become your stranded asset. So yeah, as if you see over here how they have defined it, it is suffered from unanticipated or premature write-downs, devaluation, or conversion to liabilities. So it could be, so that's the game over here, that it's unanticipated. So right now, or say even like maybe not right now, but like 15, 20, 30 years back, someone owning a coal plant would be you would definitely be making a lot of money out of it. But if suddenly at this point of time, if it just closes down, it's unanticipated, right? So that becomes a stranded asset for you. You might have to write it down. Yeah. So the concept of assets being left behind by external forces leading to reduced valuation or complete write-downs, not new, and it links to the idea of creative destruction. So creative destruction in the sense that you actually, to move forward, you need this thing to not exist anymore, right? It could be state-of-the-art facilities and everything, but if you want to move forward, in this case, from a climate or sustainability point of view, you need that thing to not exist or not be operational anymore. So unburnable carbon, for example, known oil or coal reserves that cannot be fully exploited if the agreed goal of limiting warming to 2 or 1.5 degree are to be met, thus making coal mines or oil fields into stranded assets. The concept of stranded assets still refers most commonly to these assets with high transition risk, though the definition has been steadily expanding. So yes, so you can, at least for the purpose of this exam, you can limit yourself to knowing, or like you can always learn more, but its stranded assets are caused by transition risk. So if I remember correctly, I think there were some questions in when I had appeared where they would give you some kind of a scenario and then tell you ki, if they do mention a stranded asset, that some asset has been stranded, and then they will ask you to classify it as, what do you think? Do you think it's a physical risk or a transition risk? So from the example of it, it might seem very physical risk-like, but the very fact that they have mentioned that it's a stranded asset means that it arose from a transition risk. Just have a look at, yeah, you could move forward. So then we have indirect risks such as supply chain, legal, and systemic risks. I think this is what was being talked about. So again, in a business, it's not just your assets or facilities by itself which is doing the business, right? So there are a lot of things at play. So you will, of course, the biggest being supply chain, you will have some kind of legal ups and downs, and then you will have the systemic risks. Everything is at play there. So physical risks do not only affect assets and the companies that own them through exposure to hazards, but there are several other ways in which climate-related physical risk can affect assets and firms. Perhaps the most straightforward of these is supply chain risk. So you might have few things outsourced, or you might have logistics partners, so on and so forth, perfectly fine. You might not be in control of the business, but still, if that logistics partners' warehouses are going down because of one of these physical risks, your business also gets affected, right? So for the logistics partner, it becomes a physical risk directly, but for you, it becomes an indirect risk in the form of your supply chain being affected. So the next most important kind of indirect risk is liability risk, where firms suffer financial consequences after being held legally liable. Liability risk can exist for both physical and transition risk. So there are some things where you might be, so you might have read the cases of few gas companies being held responsible for all the climate related harms that they have done, right? So that becomes a legal liability for you. You did not really see them coming, but yeah, those kind of shareholder actions or some kind of legal liabilities will create some kind of climate risk for you. And third category are the indirect physical risk that can be considered systemic in their propagation effects and their multifaceted nature. A good example would be nascent literature from academia and policymakers quantifying the effects of heat stress on worker productivity, right? The ILO, for instance, estimates that by 2030, when the global temperature is expected to have risen by 1.3 degree, the share of total working hours lost will be 2.2%, or the equivalent of 80 million full-time jobs, up from 1.4% and 35 million jobs as recently as 1995. In monetary terms, it estimates this loss of at USD $2.4 trillion in purchasing power parity terms compared to $280 billion in 1995, meaning a net loss of over $2.1 trillion in 35 years of climate change alone. So this basically talks about the human capital part of it, the risk imposed on human capital due to climate change. And I think you could definitely label it as a systemic risk.
Do we need to remember these figures? Like, is it
No,
important?
no, absolutely not. So the one good part about this entire exam is you don't need to rote learn or remember figures or anything. You should understand the concept behind it, that yes, there are due to the weather's changing, people are getting affected, there is a purchasing power parity, you're losing XYZ in revenue. You don't need to remember what the XYZ is.
So no question on numbers.
No question on numbers.
That's good.
Yeah.
Actually, yes.
Yeah. It was a big
Because
deal when I was giving the exam. Like, I was really frustrated about how to remember that, because the examples that you see across the book, right, even the case studies, they become very important from my exam point of view. But you do not need to remember any figures. You just need to understand what are they trying to indicate by giving these numbers to you. What are they trying to explain to you? That's it. You do not need to remember these figures. That's it. Yeah. Pratiksha, next slide. Yeah. Opportunities, resilience, and adaptation. Okay. While many climate risk management discussions seek to balance risks with opportunities when discussing physical risk specifically, the argument is harder to make. Physical risk, at least for private sector counterparts, tend to bring more downside than upside. So I think that's very valid in the sense that in other senses, say, for example, for transition risk, right? You move forward, you go and tell a management that, okay, if we move from, say, a normal vehicle to a EV, electric scooty or something like that, you will get a better customer sentiment aligned to it. You would possibly reduce costs. There are hundreds other benefits to it. You will get easier mobility. There are a lot of upsides, right? You can sell the upside. But when it comes to physical risk, you're not really selling an upside. Rather, what you're doing is you are protecting yourself. You are creating some kind of a strategy to protect yourself from not having loss. Fayda to nahi hoga, but at least you should not get a loss out of it. That is what this physical so that's why you can kind of say that physical risk is more difficult to sell as a climate strategy to people who are not really big believers of incorporating climate into your business strategy. Yeah. So paying large amounts to adapt and fortify facilities against physical risks, such as through building fire breaks, flood walls, or better AC systems, does not provide a profit or revenue stream, but rather simply avoids large losses that would have otherwise happened. It is easier to envision a scenario where some firms and financial counterparts stop investing in areas that are more vulnerable to physical climate risk, such as low-lying coastal areas, leaving only the most vulnerable there, such as homeowners unable to sell residential properties, allowing physical climate risk to become a problem for government exclusively. So these are problems. So it becomes a problem for governments, and it also becomes a problem for individuals in the sense of insurance, right? So today, if I have to go and take some kind of insurance for my property, and if it's because insurance players have started taking into account these kind of climate related risk into their calculations, right? Into their actuarial related work that they do. So over there, if it's an interplay of various financial institutions again, and at the very end of it, since public welfare becomes government responsibility and none of these financial institutions want to have any kind of role to play in it, it just becomes it just gets thrown off to the government as a government's problem. As this example mentions, if a particular area is labeled as this being high physical risk, it will be very difficult for you to get an insurance there, or possibly could have like a skyrocketing premium to pay. You will not get sellers, you won't be able to do anything with that property. You might be scared for your own life, that you just simply don't want to live there, you want to move somewhere else, but you can't possibly do anything about the property which is there. So it becomes a problem for the government exclusively, as should not be the case. And yeah, we'll see further. Yes, transition risk and opportunity. So again, as I mentioned, physical risk, the opportunity side is not as high in physical risk as it is in transition risk, because there's a lot of revenue streams that can come up from transition risk, and what you possibly do with your business to transition to a low carbon strategy. So over here, so in a BAU scenario, assume that with no economic transition, CO2 levels will continue to rise from the current level of around 40 gigatons per year to possibly around 60 to 120 gigatons. So for these figures, it's actually more difficult if you go through these numbers like this, and instead if you just, there are a lot of charts mentioned in the book itself where they give you these charts about what is the normal scenario and what is the 1.5 scenario, what is the 2 scenario, what would possibly happen if you go to a 4-degree scenario, and so on and so forth. So when you go through the book and look at those diagrams, these things become more clear to you. To reach the scales assumed in these models would require massive and extremely rapid rollout of technology and practices, such as directly capturing CO2, known as direct air capture, or bioenergy with carbon capture and storage growing plants, which absorb CO2 from the air, then burning them to generate electricity, but capturing CO2 from combustion and burying them, thus resulting in net removal. So over here, it just talks about various strategies, as we even spoke about before, about when we were having the net zero discussion, about what are the different ways people could possibly offset becomes one part, and also reduce their carbon emissions. Therefore, more recently, there has been a recognition that the means through which emissions, the drivers of transmission risk, will actually be reduced, will be more varied and less neat than simply imposing a high carbon tax that would seem an optimal solution in economic models, but has so far struggled to gain ground in light of political realities. Then we have TCFD outlined best practices in describing transition risk drivers as including policy, legal risk, encompassing factors ranging from mandatory shutdowns to legal liability, technology risk, you have the examples, then you have reputational risk and other risks such as market risk. So this is what we were talking about. The book does cover everything as defined by TCFD.
Hi, I have just one question. Like, can avoided losses can be treated as opportunities?
No, avoided losses are not an opportunity, right?
Okay.
Opportunity is something which has a future revenue stream assigned to it. So
Okay.
can say you installed a flood wall. So you're not really creating some new revenue stream from it. What you're doing is protecting your existing one. So it's just a loss avoiding activity.
It's mostly like related to revenue. Like you have to be a revenue stream.
I mean, I'm just simplifying it to bring it back to the financial part, but it's not just related to revenue, but it should, but from a business point of view, revenue is an opportunity, right? Like it's the easiest or the most simplest way to understand what is an opportunity for you.
Okay, thank you.
Even the climate strategies that companies come up with, it's basically, you can consider it both as a loss avoiding strategy. So for example, that entire video that Apple came up with for their sustainability strategy, right? It could be, one is to sway the consumer emotions, or to create some kind of a image of what the brand is, right? So you can call it both the ways. It's a loss avoiding. So any customer who is like very conscious about their footprint, they'd be like, no, if an XYZ company is not doing it, I won't buy their products. So in that sense, it becomes a loss avoiding activity for them. Also in the same beat, there will be a lot of company individuals who will be like, oh, so Apple is doing so much, so I should possibly buy their phone instead of another one, maybe of the same range or something. So then that becomes an opportunity for the company. So same activities can be seen in both ways, but yeah, it's at the end of the day, when it comes to a business or profit-making institution, it's, you can always think of it in a way, oh, is it creating revenue for you? It's not. So you can make decisions that way. Yeah. Moving forward, policy and legal risks. So over here, you can find that classic policy solutions for achieving emission reduction have tended to be either carbon tax, setting a price on emission, cap and trade schemes which set a limit on quantity. But other policies can also lead to transition risk, examples of which is energy efficiency, such as energy requirements for residential buildings or emissions required for new automobiles, which can be set at either the level of individual vehicles or at the fleet level. Another source of policy risk is government-mandated closures, ranging from cancellation of previously agreed fossil fuel infrastructure projects, such as natural gas pipelines, and mandatory shutdowns, dates for certain type of high-emitting facilities, such as coal-fired power plants. So yeah, it's basically just about government policies and legal. So anyone comes and throws some kind of litigation at you, or the government comes and shuts down some facility of yours, due to doing some activities which was possibly affecting the climate. So it could have a risk for you. Yeah, move forward. Then we have technology risks. So changing technology is a benefit or is even a prerequisite for taking care of few of these risks, but it could also serve as a risk for you in the sense that your technology is getting obsolete. So then that becomes a risk for you. So you upgrading. So again, like your question, so you upgrade. If you upgrade yourself, great, it's an opportunity. But if you don't upgrade yourself, then it's also a loss. So you upgrading yourself could be seen in two ways. Yes, you're grabbing an opportunity too, but you're also protecting yourself from a future thing getting obsolete. So you're protecting yourself from losses. So you can look at it in both the ways. Yeah. Then you have reputational risk and consumer pressure. So reputational risk, as we spoke about the Apple example, right? So it is in a way Apple is, so you will have a lot of examples. There's a common notion that, not just a notion, but then a lot of how and where are these Apple parts being made, from which your iPhones and various Apple devices are getting made from. So there's a lot of reputational risk assigned to it. So it's not just about what the consumer or an individual like us is thinking about it, but then there are a lot of financial institutions also at play who will say that if this is a general consumer sentiment, then possibly you do not have a long future, right? So that is where the reputational part of it becomes important. When you sell yourself as a climate positive, or and not just sell yourself, actually even do those things. So though you are kind of curbing those risks for yourself, and also consumer pressure, because the individuals, the consumers that you have are your bread and butter. So if you don't understand what your consumer sentiments or what your consumer expectations are, you cannot possibly sustain in the business. And right now in this environment, climate consciousness, sustainability is a very big consumer ticker, right? So these are things which you would need to consider in your business strategies. Yeah. Go ahead, Pratiksha.
Hey, what kind of a question they ask on this particular thing? Do they ask what is social license to operate and everything?
So in the entire exam, right, you will not have something which directly says explain social license to operate.
No. Like if something is happening and what concept it is, do they ask certain things like that?
No, they won't really ask you that, but they will possibly give you an entire example and then ask you to identify which kind of risk do you think it is. Is it a reputation risk? Is it a whatever a technological risk? So you'll have to correctly identify. So your key to getting those right is going through the entire book and seeing what would you consider to be the keywords for each of these. So going back to, for example, for stranded asset, right? A very key word for stranded asset is transition risk. So you can always consider it that way. So if you get something which talks about stranded asset, transition risk could be answer. If transition risk hai, then stranded asset could be an answer. So just know where are the interplay of these words there.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
And no calculation also asked, right?
No calculation.
No
in the entire book, you'll find no calculations present.
Okay.
I mean, even if there are, like when I was giving the exam, I'm not sure of the future chapters where they talk about quantifying like climate models and all. I'm not sure about what they have done with the 23 book, but there were some formulas present. But like even if they do ask you to calculate something, the formula will be given in the question also, or in like in a side tab. So you just need to know which numbers to put where. It's not that you have to memorize a formula, but you should just understand what are we even trying to calculate with this.
Okay, because I think in chapter 6 or 7 there is a model explained. Maybe there
Right.
is a calculation. So just asking. Okay,
Yeah, yeah.
fine.
So I have not seen those chapters for the 23 book, but when I gave the exam, they do, I believe when there were some formulas. So there was something about climate beta and climate alpha, something like that. But they do give you the formula for it also. And they won't directly ask you for the final result. What do you get? So they would possibly ask you to calculate it and be like, oh, so do you think this project is viable? Do you think this is too high a risk, too low a risk? Something like that.
Yeah, I found one related question when I practicing last week.
Okay.
One mining company that operate in multiple locations, starting liquid and operates in multiple tailings dams or for storing liquid waste. But due to the internal misproper maintenance, one of the dams burst, causing severe damage and loss of lives. And after that, the incident investors has scrutinized, and regulators are also making regulator also started finding what are the reason. So making it challenge for company to take permission for future operation. So it's a question related to the social lines to operate. So what would the cause of this risk and what is the impact? So I was confused about particular some it's a reputational risk it seems, but cause of this risk is a physical risk because it's causing human lives.
So does the question have the term, the social license to operate in it?
Yes.
Yes, then that means that's again your key to answering it, which would make it reputational risk.
Reputational risk.
Yeah. So that's what the entire exam is based on about. It's about catching these few things that they're assigning. So over here, for example, if you just go through the entire book, right, you'll realize that few things keep repeating itself or they stress upon certain parts. So as you mentioned this particular case over here, it again seems very likely to physical risk or something else. But the fact that they mention social license to operate means it's the expected answer out of it is reputational risk. If you have to think of it outside of an exam point of view, it is all these risks. But
it was not correctly, it was not similar exactly mentioned, but it was mentioned that company to secure permission to operate in future.
yes, exactly. Yeah. Pratiksha, you can move forward. I think we covered, no, market risk. Yes, market risk we didn't cover. Yeah. So another notable source of transition risk include the notion of market risk, which is related to the demand and supply chains, demand and supply sides of economies. So a broad range of potential supply, demand, and pricing effects. So the most straightforward kind of market transition risks related to the shifting demand from high emission products to low carbon products and commodities. Another kind of market transition risk that is already manifesting itself is through shareholder perception or pressures in public markets. A large portion of the value ascribed to oil and gas firms, for example, has historically been due to their proven reserves, but now that a portion of these reserves seem likely to become stranded, market capitalizations of oil majors have fallen. So when you go through the book, right, they'll actually give you the exact numbers of what their market caps were and what they are right now. So it will give you a better sense. And also, like, yeah, just a second, I read something. Yeah, demand and supply, again, you could possibly think of the Apple example itself and about shareholder actions are getting, so like companies are actually making changes or like advertising their ESG strategies, sustainability strategies to create some kind of perception and also to sway their shareholders to believe that yes, they're doing something good. Yeah. Move forward, Pratiksha. Yes, stranded human capital and just transitions. So the example that we discussed before about how climate risk was affecting your human capital itself, right? So this is just kind of elaborated on the same thing. So when you talk about assets, or at least even in the 22 book, right? If you look through it, the 22 book talks about assets in just in case or in the sense of tangible assets. But I was really happy to see that they have included this part about intangible assets and IPs and such, and also human capital and just transition. This was not part of the 22 book. So intangible assets such as IP, social network, and company reputation can also become stranded, and so can the skills and expertise held by workers and professionals. So as you can see right now, there are, again, if I have to take an example of a financial analyst, say 10 years back, the basic expectations where you have an understanding of the markets, you have an understanding of basic Excel, like all your Microsoft things, and maybe that's about it, right? But even to date, like if you look through some kind of job posting, it's going to be really I think enduring to see that a lot of these simple financial analyst posts actually ask you to have a basic sense of climate risk, or like climate understanding, or some kind of climate modeling. Till date, if you had to talk about valuation, it was just about the various valuation models which existed to, I don't know, just value your companies, right? But right now, the risk factors which were taken before, whatever your normal risk factors are, but right now there are some expectations being created that you will also know how to include these kind of climate related risks into the same models. So that is actually a way of seeing that how skills and expertise which are expected from an individual are changing. This is just an example I took of the financial sector, but like I'm sure all of you would have other examples to add on to this. So just transition, if I have to take up the same example of the IC industry, right? So there's a whole ecosystem at play there. One fine day you come and say that, okay, ICs are not good, so we don't need ICs, we want to go the EV way. But there needs to be people who will help the people who are busy in the IC industry to move smoothly to the EV side of things, right? There should be trainings, coachings, just to ensure that. So it's very easy to say that, okay, I need to move there, it's cleaner, greener, but clean and green cannot happen without understanding the social aspect of things. So that is where just transition comes into play. So of course, again, there will be some kind of, there are financial motivations to it too. So that's why you'll see all these big time motor companies who are coming with such big EV related fleets, right? But it's the transition needs to be both ways. So even the social consequences of any of these shifts need to be considered. And that's the part where just transition comes into play. And you will find a lot of literature on it about how different. So just transition, again, cannot be just the government's responsibility or just the private partners' responsibility. So there are a lot of strategies, policies which come into play. And there's actually a very good example given on just transition on the book too, if you want to go through it. So yeah, over here they give the example of retraining provided by companies and governments. The faster the pace of decarbonization, the greater chance of stranded asset in different sectors, and larger the likely economic, social, and political consequences that need to be managed. Yeah. Move ahead. I think this is the last slide. Yes, transmission into finance, the economy, and key sectors. So climate risk matter not only for the assets or firms directly affected, but also because they can propagate and have an effect throughout the financial system and the broader economy and key sectors. Ultimately, climate risk becomes relevant to risk managers when climate change's physical impacts or government policies meant to reduce emissions have an effect on balance sheets and portfolios of firm or financial institutions. So yeah, this kind of talks of the same thing. It's very, so when you think of the entire thing, we are not really, yes, we do, it does talk about balance sheets and everything. Could you just go back to that slide? It does talk about balance sheets and everything, but always remember, these are just the micro indicators of what's happening on a macro level, which is the economy at whole. So when you talk about these things, it just becomes very easier and it just becomes very nitpicky on what exactly is causing all of these changes. And that's what this talks about. So the transmission of climate related strategies and risk factors into the finance, economy, and other key sectors. Yeah, move ahead. Yes. So there were these two case studies which is present in the book itself. So one is on real estate. So it's a very big study. Actually, we cannot really cover it here, but I just thought we can add this screenshot over here. So if you just look at it, it talks about the series of effects of what happens when sea level rises happen. And you can interpolate back to all the hazards and all the vulnerabilities and that discussion that we had. So over here, it's just a snapshot of the case study itself. They have given us a pictorial depiction of it. Sea level rise and more frequent storms would lead to coastal properties. What happens to those coastal properties from sea level rises? You will have a greater risk of current future flooding. What happens due to this greater risk? You will have a lower property value. Now, talking about how is this lower property value affecting the financial institutions, which are the banks and the markets. So the banks becomes a smaller player, the market will sit on top. So a bunch of banks form the market. So the banks over here become effects on residential and commercial property mortgages. So our ability to take loans on those property reduces. So you possibly want to buy a second property by keeping the the coastal property mentioned over here as mortgage. You can't possibly do that. So it affects your financial health. But what is affecting your financial health at the end of the day and on a macro level is the sea level rise, which is due to climate change. And then on a market level, you have effects on mortgage securitization and mortgages backed assets. So now these banks are selling you these loans, but on the back end, there are also people who are coming and there are tradings happening on the basis of these mortgage loans, right? So there is the selling of buying and selling of loans as a package also. Now that becomes a financial thing to talk about, but on a whole, that is how the market also. So if you're not able to have these mortgage loans in the first place, what will you buy and sell on a market level? So that gets affected. Okay, Aditya has something to share. Banks refused to cover the damages for New Zealand flood, which has never anticipated. Yes, exactly, definitely. Okay, we can move to the next slide. Yes, the next study case study was about electricity generation. So you have a coal-fired power plant. So and it's been asked for a mandatory shutdown. So the risk at play over here is transition or policy risk. And over here, then you have, what do you do about it? The transition and technology risk part of it will become build new renewable energy projects become cheaper than operating existing coal. And what happens due to it is loss of revenues, asset write-offs, so it causes stranded assets. Then you have electric utilities, so you have lower returns, rising default risk, so you possibly cannot repay your loans. So which leads to how it affects the financial counterparts, which is the lenders, investors at this. So they will get lower returns and they will get so they will have to deal with rising default risk. And how it affects the customers is higher prices because they are dealing with all of this and they need money to finance all of it. Yeah. I think that was our last slide, right, Diksha?
Hey, yes. So can we take questions like later after like 10-15 minutes break, because we are on on time, but off bit. So
Yeah, sure. We can do that.
like 15 minutes break. So we'll join at 11:05. Yeah.
Sure. What's the time? We'll join at 11:05, is it? So that's like
Oh,
more than
sorry.
30
Oh
minutes.
my God, I'm so confused right now. Okay, 10:30.
I think we can resume at 10:45.
Oh, 10:45. Okay, fine.
So that becomes a 23-minute break.
It's a too much time that we are giving, right?
Sorry?
I think 10:35 would be better. 15 minutes.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
10:35.
Thank God. Okay, this is the question.
Answer should be D.
Hi, everyone. Can
I think
we please talk about this?
maybe D.
D. D.
Yeah, D. I think D.
I guess would be C.
Yes, my guess is also C because it's about an investment company and they might like do a review about the strategy to reduce the standard asset risk. C.
Because it's board level, it can't be little operational. So investment strategy seems to be a more board level
There is
appropriate
investment
topic.
company is a fossil fuel company, and there is might be chance that government may impose regulation that may be shut down in future because all the countries are moving to the low fossil fuel. So there is
Uh,
might be a chance to shut down. So if it's shut down, then definitely with a premature write downs and asset increase asset no, it also increase asset valuation. No, no, answer should not be D. Applies premature write-downs to increase asset valuation. Capabilities index will continue to economic growth, possible impact of geological repricing.
Okay, so do we have a final answer? Because this is in a last year question paper.
Most of the investment strategy we use.
So my logic is standard asset risk, uh, like you cannot gain anything out of that till you reduce the valuation. So that's why my logic goes with answer D.
Answer should be D, but only thing that write down to decrease asset valuation. Not should be
The
D.
answer should be C because the board, since it sees increased standard risk, needs to reconsider their strategy on fossil fuel. Because it is an investing fund, right? So
right.
if seeing a premature write down of assets, they will start losing money.
Answer will be the C.
So they need to reconsider their investment strategy.
I'd probably change my answer from C to something else now, because the question is saying stranded asset issue that the board wants to consider. So obviously the question is about the issue and not so much about. I mean, so I'm kind of now a bit confused. But my first bet was C. I might go to either D, or D is possibly a more appropriate expectation at this point in time. Sorry, please go ahead.
Because standard risk are like standard assets are which are not the company is not using that asset. Maybe the company has got one like operational warehouse which is not functional now, but it is in their asset, but it's not working properly. So my logic goes with answer D, that applying premature. Maybe they will sell it off on loss or something like that, but
Right.
at least it will remove it from their asset.
I don't think
So
they have mentioned that it is a standard asset. They have mentioned that it receives a report that analyzes the exposure of the fund portfolio to standard asset risk.
yeah,
Right?
that's what I am giving you the example. They have a warehouse which is not operational, but it is an asset in their books.
No, but
So maybe they will sell it on a loss or
Who will buy it? Everybody know that the regulation will come in future. So nobody is
no,
buying for this.
no, they will get a buyer, but it will be
Yeah,
on a
who will
loss.
buy? Who will buy the? Who will buy
No,
the?
so I will for warehouse. I will sell the land. I'm not worried about the warehouse. Land is valuable. I will send the land,
Okay, so this
but
is
it will be in a loss.
I have a base. I have a question. Why is no one considering point B? Because if we're just talking about exposure and this one, wouldn't repricing fossil fuels be the first indicator for a standard asset? Like, why is no one talking about point B? Just out of clarity.
Market, there's no any market risk associated.
No, so repricing of fossil fuel asset
That's the
will
exposure
create.
risk, right?
Yeah, but it will create inflation. It's not only like the organization is dependent on fossil fuel, and the government if increases the fossil fuel repricing, then it's not only the companies getting affected, it's the whole country, the whole, everybody is getting infected. The inflation will increase. So
Okay.
it's not only that company who's dependent on fossil fuel. The others are also dependent, na? So
Okay.
just repricing, yeah. For example, petrol, if I increase the petrol price from 110 to 150, it's not only the one firm will get affected, it's the whole country will get affected. The inflation will go up,
Right.
the prices of commodity will go up. So that is not the answer. That is what my logic is. But I'm
C is also not the answer, because if there is in any country fossil fuel investment has been, so how the investment has done. So I think the C is answer nahi hoga.
So the option C is more vague in nature, right? When you talk about fossil fuel investment strategy, fossil fuel investment strategy could go in 100 different ways to reduce standard
yes.
asset. What are you possibly doing with it? You are talking about a particular asset. You are talking about what are you going to do with that stranded asset itself. What you could possibly do is option D, right? Applying premature write-downs to it to get it off your books and then deal with the rest. Then from a stranded asset point of view, what you're doing is writing it down. So then your correct answer becomes D.
Guys, stop fighting. Answer is B in the SCR book. So is the role of geopolitics and the possible impact on repricing fossil fuel asset is an issue that board might take into account when considering the risk of stranded asset. It's saying is the answer is B.
But fossil fuel repricing is not a board's decision, right?
No, but so how I understood was the question was we're just understanding what the exposure risk is and what the board is going to pay attention. So in that report, you're not going to get an investment strategy or like what to do in terms of write downs. The only thing they're going to say is there's going to be repricing. So that's why the board is going to pay attention to that. This is how I understood the question.
No, but
Which is why I
that
was asking why no one is looking at it.
repricing is not dependent on the firm's decision.
Right,
It's a
but this is
government
what they
decision.
will take into account when they're making that decision, right?
Tomorrow, if government wants, they can give subsidy also. Today, petrol is 110. Subsidy में कल मेरे को 90 में मिलेगा. That's a government decision. It's a fossil fuel.
Okay.
It's
So
not a
next,
firm's
we
decision.
have like another lecture as well. I'll thank you. I feel very bad when I stop someone, so I never do that, but I have to for certain reason as an organizer. Okay, shall we move on to the
No,
next?
so what? One request, like we should spend more time on question answer, because the different logic we all give, that is more important to find out the answer actually, because
No,
the same question won't come, but the logic and reason the all people are coming together, that is I think more important. But yeah, it's up to you.
okay, thank you for valuable inputs. So I have added the answer over here, but yeah, I'll do that from the next chapter 4. We will do that more often.
Angie, thank you.
Yeah. Can we do this one? Otherwise, there are a simple question as well, but this was into last year exam, so that's why I picked it up from there.
B, right? Supply chains.
Okay, you can.
I think it's A, technology, because it's talking about financial systems.
I think it should be B. Agree with B. The reason being, it is a physical risk, and physical risk can disrupt supply chains.
And we have studied, right, like indirect risks, supply
It's talking
chains.
about physical risks, technology supply chain and technology policy are the transition risks, legal also. Maybe a supply chain physical risks, but legal risk is also a transition and physical both. So either B or D, B legal. I think B. B is the answer. because particularly it mentioned physical risk exposure. Technology would not be a physical risk at all. Policy is not. Yeah. Legal is also both
I
physical
think
and.
technology is part of physical risk, right?
No, it's not. No, it's
No,
not
it's
transition
not a
risk.
physical, it's transition.
Transition risk. So first you have to write off that options. Technology and policy will remove it. Supply and legal we can discuss on it. Supply is the physical risk, is the operational effect, or is geographical. If somebody is exporting something from other country, their supply is concerned. So like lithium ion battery. So supply chain would be the most appropriate answer according to me.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, right. You are right. It is a supply chain answer because obviously it is written on physical risk exposure. And as you said, that we need to eliminate technology and policy. There is not a mention of legal. So, yeah, it is a supply chain risk. And the reason they have given over here, so you can check in the this box. Can you see this box? Okay. Last question.
But
Okay.
Srini, after this question, we can just throw light on legal and liability risks, whether it is applicable for physical or transition. Sometimes it's also applicable for transition. So can
I think it was discussed in the slides that these legal and reputational risks, they are indirect transition risk, but they are under the indirect risk category.
I think you have to pay attention
Yes.
to pay attention to legal. The word is legal. It's not liability. If it is liability, then it can be physical as well. But if it is legal, it is transition.
Support liability to pay something. Suppose somebody is imposing penalty, it's a liability. Or somebody imposing restrictions not to operate business to legal.
I think it would come under the purview of legal only. Like, that's what I think.
Yeah. Go ahead, Pratiksha.
Okay, okay.
Can you just move it the projected?
Doing it.
Oil and gas. B. Answer should be B. Highest exposure of standard asset. Or there is it's also case study.
A. So the coal is also.
Yeah, coal is also, but the highest, the person is highest. Oil and gas, and then utility.
Won't it be hydroelectric because it's already stranded?
Hydroelectric shutdown dams operation is also likely to sustain broad.
Yeah, actually, hydroelectric.
But isn't that already like there is no more value out of that because it is already end of life?
So you would divest that, right? That's the question, right?
Right, I agree.
I think it will be A. We can switch from coal to lower cost natural gas.
It says the analyst identifies the company with highest standard asset exposure. So highest standard asset exposure is utility, right? Because rest of them has no asset left because oil and gas is pretty much declined. Hydroelectric is run out of water.
No, so this is energy companies, right? So they are a portfolio of an energy company. So if it is energy company, then it will be oil and gas or maybe utility. But again, by the question energy companies, I will go with then oil and gas. But utility, we can we get electricity from coal also.
The utility
I will
utility.
I will go with utility.
Utility also, because I remember somewhere I read that the straightforward way climate is affect the electric utility sector is through transition risk.
Anji, I will go with utility.
It's a coal fire project, as it's mentioned now, California. With
What is the answer?
Do we? Okay, एक second, huh?
Anji.
I am not able to skip my screen. Just give me 1 minute. It is written the answer is C, but I am also confused that it is not C.
Should be C.
no, it's not this.
See, the dollar value of the exposures are not given here. So when we say highest stranded asset exposure, we should assume proportion to the not to the investment. And maybe hydroelectric is almost tending towards 100% because it's a permanent loss. So maybe that could be the logic.
If you shut down the hydroelectric
It's
dam
a strict
operations,
startup,
but
is it? C. Okay.
Okay, no.
Sorry.
Give me 1 sec. So the person who explains this answer is. So the thing is that I got this from some resources.
Answer is B.
Answer is B, and they have given explanation as well, and they have given page number as well. I'm really sorry about that.
oil and gas. ठीक है, energy company.
First answer.
It's very complicated, but okay.
Yeah, I'm really not convinced with this. I mean, if we talk about coal also, each and every country has taken a target that they will reduce the coal consumption as well, just like on oil and gas. So, and the point, hydroelectric also, sustained droughts, somebody mentioned. And I
No,
think
but
in
in hydroelectric, they are talking about shutdown of dam operations before the end. But what is the substitute? They're getting energy out of that. That is not mentioned. So hydroelectric will be away. Technology, it's fine. It's not there. It's only between utility and oil and gas.
I think the concept of standard, I think in literature, in book, the concept of standard access comes from the oil and gas industry only. So, and it is also mentioned, they have ranking that oil and gas is the most affected for standard assets. Then utilities, then other things. It is mentioned.
We went through the definition of standard assets, like where like unanticipated, like sudden you have to like write off and all. So in case of hydroelectric, we have like sudden droughts and all. It's not functioning up to its capacity, and we need to shut it down before its usual life. So I think it's a bit subjective, like yeah.
Anji. Agree.
Okay, can we have the last question, and then we will move on to chapter 4. Even I realize that this is not easy to come down to 1 hour. So for this particular workshop, let's stick to the time.
प्रतीक्षा पास मार्क क्या है एग्जाम का?
पास मार्क 7 कितने आंसर्स कुछ तो करने हैं. मैं भी बहुत कंफ्यूज्ड हूँ, but
pass mark is actually not on the basis of how many you answer correct, but it's on the basis of percentile. So I think the top 50.
But what would be a good number to crack? 70%, 60%?
No. The passing last year was in April 2023 was 52%.
No, that's because of some cutoff that applied. So
no. So
like number of applicants
out of 100, only 52 people passed.
Yeah, so the question still is, what's a good number? Like अभी 4 attempt किया, 2 तो आराम से गलती आ गया.
हाँ मतलब नहीं मतलब that is I also checked with few people, they are also not sure. तो आपका अगर जितने लोग एग्जाम देते हैं ना तो परसेंटेज उनका बढ़ जाता है, but it is always 50 to 55%.
Yeah, on the video
कैसे
that Pratiksha sent yesterday, it says that the committee decides every exam how much the percentage should be.
हाँ जी.
Sometimes I think GARP purposely make the questions so confusing so that people can
हाँ जी.
source of revenue.
हो सकता लास्ट ईयर 70% पासिंग होगा, इस साल शायद 80% होगा, तो that totally changes. हाँ.
But just let try to give a right answers with the assumptions and I don't know, like this is very complicated, it seems. Okay, can we have this last question so that we can move on?
I think it
This
should be
question,
C.
yeah, I think this would be A around. Okay, but this question is from chapter 6, Pratiksha. This question is from chapter 6, micro and macro economic transmission channel. But yeah, we can attempt definitely.
Energy projected move.
I think it's A, because it's talking about liquidity risk. So the company is not able to pay the loan. So that's a risk, liquidity risk.
D. Answer should be D.
C and D are credit risk, I believe.
D is the liquidity risk. When the climate disasters happen, so people have tendency to withdraw money from the banks. The bank's loan to deposit ratio would be the high. So in the liquidity risk, the matrix for liquidity risk is the bank to deposit is high. When it is high, then bank customer withdraw deposit and draw credit lines finance. So that
No, that is fine, but it is talking about the insurance firm, not a bank's customer. In the question, it's about insurance firm.
It's talking about the liquidity risk.
Like yes.
Example on
how climate risk affect liquidity risk.
Liquidity risk is
answer should be liquid. It's always about the money. How early you liquidate your money, hard money. How you deposit money you draw. That is liquidity risk. I think I'm sure for answer D.
Answer is D.
Yeah. It's a matrix.
Yeah, I got, but in the question it is talking about the insurance firm.
No, it's a technique. They are just confusing. They are just trying to confuse you. But main question is that how climate is affecting liquidity risk. And the matrix of liquidity risk is 3. One is loan to deposit is too high. Okay. And so it means that when the loan to deposit is high, the people have tendency to withdraw money from the bank. When
No, so it is talking about the insurance firm, right? First of all, the company is insurance firm. I'm not talking I'm not talking about the bank or any individual. It's about the insurance firm. So my logic, I'm giving you my logic why the answer is A. Because two points are involved. One is climate risk affecting liquidity risks, right? The climate risk, if you see the answer A, the company warehouse that is damaged by the tornado causes business interruption. That
It's
is
operation risk.
climate
It's
risk.
operation risk, not the liquidity. It's operation. It's affecting your operation, day-to-day activities. If tornado affect your warehouse,
No. So tornado is climate risk, right? And the
tornado
result.
is a physical risk. Tornado impacting your warehouse. So what is the immediate impact? The operation will shut down. Then the operation shut down. Then the whatever your loan have been taken from the bank, then credit risk arises. After credit risk, then can default. I think
Yeah,
first
yeah.
option A is related to operational risk.
Okay. Chandan sir is right, and this is like 6 chapter question, and even I have read about the operation risk and everything. This is the thing which they opt for when like bank customer withdraw deposit and draw on credit line. This is written over there as well, so you can just check table number 6.1 and page number 121 as Asta suggested.
Okay.
I also checked it.
Okay.
Okay. So let's move ahead and let's start with the chapter 4. I know this further topics are quite like high on understanding, and everything needs expertise in each and every topic. The whole book is a bible for each one of us. But yeah, let's go ahead and start with the chapter 4, and I would appreciate if you come like pre-reading can happen before attempting the next 4 chapters. So let's go ahead with the chapter 4 right now. Okay, Sajani, you have it.
Sure. Thanks, Pratiksha. So going back to chapter 4, sustainability and climate policy, culture and governance. So again, you have the 4.1 to 4.7. These are the subtopics that it covers. And just before I begin the chapter, let me just specify this is one of the chapters which is more like theoretical in nature. Like there here, you will find things that you will kind of need to remember. So this is the chapter I personally found the most difficult to get through, because the other chapters are much more reliant on you understanding concepts. But what this particular chapter does is it talks about the various conventions, COP, where the various COPs which have happened, which COP does what, and stuff like that. So this does need you to remember certain stuff, and the kind of questions that you can expect from this are things which will be reliant on your memory. So it's not just like understanding the concept. So it's kind of like history of climate policy in a way. So yes, let's go to the next slide. Pratiksha, can we go to the next slide? Yes. Again, back to the learning objectives. I think it's very after we discuss the questions, it again just reiterates the same thing. So when you look through the even through for the mock exam or the sample questions which are given after every chapter, right, you will find that they have illustrated on which learning objective is that particular question questioning you on or like judging you on. So that's why these learning objectives become a very, very important part of every chapter. So after you're going through each of these chapters, please just take time to go back to the learning objectives, spend time on each of them. Do you think you can talk about all the points covered in each of these objectives very clearly? Can you mention the key words which show up for each one of these, like we saw in the questions before? So like someone is mentioning physical risk, so something will be the answer just because it mentions physical risk. And yeah, so it's again, so it becomes very important that you go through all these learning objectives and just see if you have covered all of them well, if you understand all of it well. So I won't be reading all of these, but yeah, we can just go through the overview of it. Just go back, no? Yeah. So again, you have the evolution of climate policy, as I mentioned, kind of historical in nature, understand the relative scale of emissions by country. So this is again a little factual. This will talk about how the developed versus developing economies kind of a debate that happens, the history, outcomes, obligations from each of these agreements, understand characteristics, explain climate policy occur at the national and subnational level, describe the different scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. So over here, you'll just have them mentioning the GHG protocol and how just the basic definitions of scope 1, 2, and 3, recognize the challenges associated with accounting for scope 3 emissions, differentiate the types of private sector sustainability and climate investment policies, and how public policy has been used to promote adoption of green finance. Describe the function, purpose, and challenges of green taxonomies. Over here, you'll just find the overviews given for each one of these. And yeah, so you just have central banks, what they do about it, identify methods to enforce sustainable investment disclosure policies, trends in private sector, difference between climate-related risk and nature-related risk, and then explain broader societal and cultural impacts of these. So you will have few new things which have come up, like the TNFD. So we spoke about TCFD in the previous one. Over here, they will give you an overview on TNFD, which is the nature-related financial disclosures. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So the first part, we have the introduction to sustainability and climate policy. So it describes the international sustainability and climate policies and the considerations that have led to be relatively slow moving. Then it examines the increasing importance of sustainability and climate policy considerations, from investment policy to supervision and regulation of the private sector, notably the private financial sector. So I think it becomes very important to understand that a lot of progress which have happened in terms of all the alignments and the policies which come up. Of course, the governments and the supranational, they have a very important role to play, but a lot of it has also been kind of championed by the private sector and led by the private sector and organized by them. So it just talks about that. Yeah. Next slide. International sustainability and climate policies. So in this section, you will find what are the various climate and sustainability related policies which have come into play. Once unmuting. I can continue. Okay. So over here, they talk about so I think it becomes very important in this part, if you go through the entire material, to create a flow chart of sorts for yourself. Hi, Someshwar, do you want to say something?
No, I think you can go ahead. And yeah, like I have created a chart, but it is for my understanding. So that would be beneficial because I learned this in environmental science as well when I was pursuing master's degree. So please do create this chart for this 4.2 to 4.9 or something.
Do you have the chart?
Hey, my chart is for me, right? So I won't
Okay, perfect. Yeah, perfect. Yeah. But I definitely do encourage all of you, if you just read through the entire matter, right? It is in a manner that what happens after what, but it would be very beneficial for you. So it's not that you have to remember years or something, but what you do need to remember is what exactly is happening in each of these agreements and protocols and whatsoever. So the first thing that they talk about, the first global agreement on climate change, was the formulation of the UNFCCC, so which is the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. The first accord on emission reduction was the Kyoto Protocol of 1997. I think we're on a different slide, Pratiksha. Let's just go back to that for a second. Yes. 1997, and the latest and most successful so far climate change mitigation agreement is the Paris Agreement of 2015. Yeah, move on. Then we have the backdrop of these climate policies. So over here, what they are doing is they are justifying why have climate policies possibly taken so much time, what are the factors which were hindrances for these, and how what's the current status of it, essentially. So over here, you will find that they talk about how did the scientific community itself discover that CO2 or like GHG greenhouse gases are a problem. So here they talk about the initial discovery of the greenhouse effect in the mid-19th century, the fact that gases such as CO2 trap heat in the atmosphere, and a Swedish scientist proposed in 1896 that fossil fuel combustion and the resulting release in CO2 concentration would result in global warming. Then we have in the 1980s, the global mean annual temperature started to rise significantly. In between, they talk about how there was a period of cooling also. So there were a lot of discussions which would happen in the scientific community that there's a period of cooling which is happening, then possibly global warming is a hoax. But of course, we know at this point of time that it's not. So in the 1980s, global mean annual temperature started to rise significantly, and the scientific consensus around the strong human influence on climate solidified, resulting in the formation of the IPCC. In 1988, an UN-convened organization of scientists, and soon therefore to be the UNFCCC. So the IPCC convened into the UNFCCC, a UN body dedicated to climate change. Then we have another important around the allocation of moral responsibility. So in the previous chapter, we were talking about who has the responsibility of these net zero goals or ambitions, right? So we spoke about the government, the private entities, how and all it lies. But this discussion, that was more on a micro level about who will have it. But this discussion is more on a macro level, whether the responsibility of achieving decreasing your emissions at least is on which kind of countries, whether it's equally everyone's responsibility, or should it be allocated to the, say, the developed economies, which obviously had more contribution to the emissions, or is it the developing economies right now because they are the ones who are polluting more, like India and China. So there are a lot of discussions which happens on these fronts. So you also have the global north versus south discussion coming up. So these are over here, the entire nature of the topic changes to more socio-political in nature. So revolves around the allocation of moral responsibility, the relationship between a country's wealth and historical emissions. So at this point, you could possibly say, obviously, US or the UK are much more richer than the other developing economies. So is it solely their responsibility or more their responsibility, or should the responsibilities be divided according to the amount of emission or the proportion of emission, total global emissions the countries make? What matters to the warming and disruption of the Earth's climate is the stock of carbon dioxide and other GHG in the atmosphere. The higher the concentration, the greater the impacts. So the annual, it was argued that those responsible for the greatest share of new emissions are the ones who must cut back the most, especially as solutions, both technical and nature-based, to remove CO2 from the atmosphere which require a lot of wealth associated to it. Go to the next slide.
Cindy, I always have confusion on point.
Yes.
What is the main argument and what is the counter agreement? Because there is two agreement mentioned in both. First agreement that those have to be, those contributed at the community basis, there has to be bear the cost. And second argument has found that those contributing the current emission have to bear the cost. So who is the main actual first argument, and then who is the counter agreement?
I did not really get. So there are two arguments you're saying. So both of them, whatever facilitates the other's argument, they come up with something else, right? So at this point, that's what these policies are talking about. So what do you think should happen? It should happen on the basis of historical emissions. If you have to take into consideration the historical emissions, then it's the presently developed economies who should bear of creating to it, so they should take. I think we can just Pratiksha, if you just jump towards the end, there is that diagram of the responsibility by country. Yes, this one. Yes, just go back to that. Yes, this one. So this talks about the cumulative CO2 emissions from 1751 to 2017 by country. So this will show you you have all the percentages given over here. This is just for you to judge and assign by yourself. But it's a good reference point to have.
Okay, shall we move on?
Yeah, we can move on.
I have one question. So is this responsibility determined by ownership, or is it just physical contribution to the GHG? What I mean to say is there may be, so Amazon has a lot of work being done in India,
right?
But the legal owner of Amazon India is Amazon US. So
right.
Would all the GHG, carbon consumption, generation in say Hyderabad, where we are today, by the AWS center, is it going to be to India's account, or will it be to US's account?
So this will go to US's account, right? Because Amazon is the parent body who is doing it.
So that's not by physical, then that's the ownership.
That's on the basis of ownership, but on the basis, as you asked, on the physical emissions, it is India's responsibility, right? On the basis of ownership, yes, it becomes Amazon and henceforth US's problem, but then we are the ones who are bearing the brunt of it.
Okay, so the chart, should I assume it's not physical, it is based on legal ownership? That's the only question I had.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so the backdrop of these climate policies. So it is argued that the country is responsible for the greatest share of cumulative emissions that are most responsible for climate change. Countries have sharply increased their share of emission in the past 2 decades. Obviously, for example, India and China are different from those responsible for accumulated historical emissions, such as the EU, US, Russia, and Japan, which are currently considered to be the developed economies, and those expected to drive future emissions unless they adopt green growth models. So the C box thing is what the diagram which was shown. This has set up a tension in international negotiations ever since, and is complicated by the fairness question around the potential trade-off between emissions and economic development. Then global emissions and attempt to reduce them constitute a classic collective action problem. That is a problem caused by disincentivizes that tend to discourage joint action by individual entities, in this case countries, in pursuit of a common goal, or where the result is a public good that benefits everyone. Yeah, go to the next slide. Yeah, we spoke about this. So the collective problem. So how is the owner? So it might be a collective problem, but how is the ownership for the problem to be distributed is what's the backdrop to creating certain policies. Yeah, next slide. So brief history of international climate agreements from Kyoto to Paris. So again, from an exam point of view, it will be easy for everyone to just read through it because it just talks of the history of it, and there is really not much to understand here. But from an exam point of view, do remember, like, you will get questions about, they will give you the context to what happened at Kyoto, and they might ask you to track back to which of these following events or like protocols do you think this was discussed in way. So it's very important to know the context to each one of these. Yeah. The origins of international climate summits can be tracked back to 1979, when the first World Climate Summit organized by World Meteorological Organization framed climate change was an issue to be addressed by global politics. In 1988, WMO was the co-creator of the IPCC, the scientific body ever more influential in subsequent years and decades. Then we have the Rio de Janeiro Earth Summit in 1992. Yeah, I think everyone can just read through it. And then we have the Kyoto Protocol, which took the form of a legally binding treaty requiring high-income Annex 1 countries to attain 5% emission reduction compared to 1990 levels by 2008 to 2012, with several mechanisms built that attempted to promote flexibility and technology transfer between countries. So again, what helps the best is if you can create a flowchart of it for yourself and then read through it. Yeah, move on, Pratiksha.
Yeah, I'll share my thing as well, making it in the infographics. I'll share because it's a handwritten notes now, that's why I'm not sharing it, but okay, I'll share it. Yeah. Because this is just about like how all formed this entities, and then how COP came into place, how IPCC worked upon, right?
Right, exactly. So again, so there is not much. So the previous chapters you could have, it came from an understanding point of view, but this is actually like the history of climate policy.
Okay.
Yeah. So immediately after its adoption, Kyoto Protocol was viewed as a resounding success and optimistic sign for the future. However, in retrospect, it was having been a failure since it did not achieve what it actually wanted it to get done. So that is again another argument against these Annex 1, or like the presently what we call as the developed countries, because they might keep these resounding targets, but they don't really achieve it. So then who's responsible? If they didn't do it in the first place, then why should smaller countries who do not have that much of capacity or the wealth to do it have the and should face the brunt for it? Then we have expectations were high that negotiations at COP15 in Copenhagen in 2009 would produce an improved binding treaty for the post-Kyoto space, as Kyoto was set to expire in 2012. Inversely to the situation with Kyoto, Copenhagen, with no agreement on a new binding treaty, was widely seen by commentators and media as an abject failure. Then in 2015,
Hey, hi, electricity gone. I'm sorry.
will you be able to screen share, or would you want me to do it?
Could you please do it till the time like electricity came in?
Sure, sure.
I have one clarification is needed.
Yeah.
Suppose the temperature should be kept below 2 degrees centigrade. This consensus is built in Copenhagen Summit. Okay. But the pursuing effort for 1.5, when it is built in the Copenhagen or Paris?
It's built in Paris, right? So it's a likely scenario. I mean, like would like to have that scenario built in Paris.
Okay, so it means that earlier it was the 2 degrees centigrade, that is conceptual built up in the Copenhagen, and then they have decided to pursuing effort for 1.5 in Paris. Okay, 2015.
Right.
Because one of the questions was related to this analogy.
Okay. Okay.
When it was built, before the Paris or?
Is my screen visible?
For me,
Yes.
but yeah, we can take other people perspective.
Sorry.
No, my internet will lag a lot, so I won't be able to contribute much. I'll have my colleague with you on board with you.
Okay, sure, no problem. No problem. Yeah, so then we have this overview from Kyoto to Paris. What else happens? Then we have the NDCs. So again, as we discussed, the nationally determined contributions require having a domestic climate policy. Section briefly reviews the principal types of climate change mitigation, that GHG emission reductions, and the policies at the national level that the countries have in place. So the countries are supposed to voluntarily come up and disclose these and disclose what are the strategies that they're coming up with or like they are doing at present. So one of such things would be the carbon pricing. So these are few of the strategies that the companies come up with on from a policy level. The countries have come up with on a policy level, and they talk kind of explain on each one of them. The first one being carbon pricing. Again, as the name suggests, it's as simple as putting a price on the carbon that you emit. So this is kind of a deterrent. So if you are pricing the carbon, if you release, say, 1 ton and you are pricing it at, say, 100 rupees, so that means that is 100 rupees off your revenue table, right? So that is kind of like the governments are trying to create a hurdle for these companies so that if you don't release this amount of carbon, as simple as you do not lose that amount of money. So we could just read into it. So carbon pricing refers principally to two types of policies: carbon taxes and emission trading scheme. So carbon pricing can then further be divided into these two: taxes and emission trading scheme, better known as cap and trade schemes. Carbon taxes impose a price per ton of CO2 emitted, have typically been favored by economists. They are a classic way of internalizing an externality by forcing emitters to pay for the social cost of their carbon emissions. And a tax in such instance is the classic prescription for economic theories. But then this goes on to describe about both the benefits and the drawbacks of carbon taxes. So, which are carbon taxes raise revenue for the government, which can be spent on further mitigating or adapting to climate change. However, in at least some countries, level of taxes are frequently tweaked, which can be detrimental to investors or businesses that need certainty over multiple years to make investment decisions. Emission trading scheme can allow industries or sectors that are more successful in reducing emissions to sell excess permits to those in sectors where emission reduction are much more expensive or even technologically infeasible with current technologies. In addition, trading schemes can create credible cash flows that can facilitate larger and long-term investment decisions, especially if the property rights and market rules of the permits are clear. On the other hand, trading schemes can cause volatile carbon pricing, or an exogenous shock such as financial crisis could lead to an oversupply of permits. So what the cap and trade scheme essentially does is it kind of incentivizes you. So if you're doing something good, you could possibly sell it to someone else. So it incentivizes you into reducing your carbon, whereas the carbon taxes is kind of the opposite mechanism, where it's actually fining you for increasing your emissions. So that would be an easier way of remembering both of these. Then we have the renewable portfolio standards, or the RPS, which is an
I have a query. Suppose you are a sustainability manager for the fossil fuel company.
Right.
And we are seeing in this company, less developed country, those are mostly reliant on fossil fuel company. So they can ask me to implement the policy carbon tax either or cap and trade. So in this scenario, suppose we are mostly reliant on fossil company, and also we are our income is less developed country. Which policy will implement carbon tax because or which or cap and trade?
So like policy from the perspective of who? Do you mean from the government perspective? Like from
as a sustainability manager. Yeah, is as a government perspective. Sorry, government perspective only.
So like again, if you have to look at it, carbon tax is more from the school of thought that you're reducing your absolute emissions. For example, say you're emitting 100 tons, you want to make it lesser. But whereas the cap and trade is more about, it's like the net zero game, right? So it's not necessarily that you're reducing your emissions, but then you could have been offsetting it by doing something else. So cap and trade kind of gives you leeways to not effectively reduce your emissions. So from a policy point of view, of course, carbon taxes make more sense, but then of course then you have the drawbacks to it as well, which is the financial aftershocks which it might create, the changes in the taxes level, which might actually deter few countries from, or like financial institutions from investing into you.
Okay, but why not cap and trade? Because there is a allowing to they're having cap and something access will be the trade to the other company. Those are not having a better technology to reduce the carbon. So it can why not cap and trade?
So cap and trade again works on the philosophy of like selling off your good deeds, right?
Yeah.
So instead of doing that, why don't you just reduce your own emissions and claim the goodness out of it for yourself?
But this allow you to some credit. This will allow you to some have liquid fund asset in future.
Yeah, definitely. Both have their own set of pros and cons. So it depends on the country policies, the other affecting policies, and a lot of other things, right? So if the cash flow is what's on your mind, then of course cap and trade makes much more sense. But from an absolute emission reduction point of view, I think carbon taxes make sense.
Yeah, but in different way. If country is having no income, country is suffering from the losses, country is suffering. There's no any. Suppose Bangladesh. I'm just giving one example. There's no money to run the net zero policies, so they need money as a country level. They can impose carbon tax to get money, so that money will be implemented in the further transition risk.
So you mean the not carbon tax, but the cap and trade system, right?
Yeah, I'm just analyzing a different perspective because I read somewhere when 1, 2, 3 question I was confused, and the answer would be the different. Sometimes the answer would be the capital, sometimes the carbon tax. The countries having less income, less developed countries, those are not having adaptive capacity, so they feel that willing to apply carbon tax to get money, and the money from the factory companies, and that money can future used for the transition or adaptation or mitigation. Okay. Similarly, in other way, companies are adapting cap and trade to get money, credit flow,
right,
in cash in hand, so that they can invest in further
technologies, carbon reducing
policies, yeah.
technologies, right? Yeah.
Okay. So it's both ways.
Yeah, definitely. It goes both ways. That's what there are a lot of factors at play. So you'll have your country's financials to look into, the company's financials to look into. So unless and until it's mandated as a policy, so there will be a lot of factors at play.
Yeah, yeah. It's also on which company and which sector is dependent on which sector. So
Absolutely.
if somebody is depending on the tourism sector, so it's definitely it's going to impact in the other way.
Right, definitely.
Okay, I got it.
Yeah. So moving on to renewable portfolio standards, which is an umbrella term for a range of quota-based regulation that aim to increase the supply of renewable electricity by requiring commercial power producers to source a specific portion of supply from renewable energy sources such as wind or solar power. So this is just again an example of what various countries are doing. So RPS is something which has been an obligation in the UK, and the renewable electricity standard on the federal level in the US. So you will find more detailed examples of what exactly it's doing and what has been the after effect of it on the book. But then again, it's just a one-time read thing. Then you have the feed-in tariffs. So what these do are offer a guaranteed price per unit of electricity generated, at which producers can sell their electricity for a fixed period of time, usually between 15 and 25 years. Sometimes these tariffs are simply set by policymakers. In other cases, they are determined through a market-based process, such as UK's contract for difference approach. Then you have what the transport sector, notably automobiles, is also an area with ample sector-specific regulations targeted at emission reduction. Both the United States and EU, alongside other jurisdictions, have fuel efficiency standards. So EU also has CO2 emission standard both for individual cars and for automobile manufacturers at the fleet level. In the automotive space, EVs, which are far less emission intensive and produce no tailpipe emissions, are in a similar position to renewable energy in the early to mid 2000s, and that it is a superior technology environmentally, but still slightly more expensive. So it talks about how they are actually financing or motivating people to transfer from ICs to EVs, and yeah, that's about it. Then we have substantial climate policies on the cities and region level. So this again talks about the C40 coalition dedicated to combating climate change, founded by 18 cities in 2005, and now with 97 members, is a transnational example and helped contribute to international pressures to bring about the Paris Agreement. Then it goes on to talk about how Donald Trump actually signed a withdrawal from the US from the Paris Agreement, and then again after Joe Biden came into play, he again signed back into it. Yes, I think this is more useful in terms of understanding. So all of this, everything that we read about, it has been summarized across this, a very good summary of what to talk, how to understand each one of these topics. So the different policies that the SCR book talks about are carbon taxing, the emission trading scheme, renewable portfolio standards, automobile fuel efficiency requirements, fuel tax, building heating energy efficiency requirements, then the ban on burning peat bogs or wetlands, and the green or low carbon public procurement. So again, I think everyone can just read through this, but what is important, again, as we saw in the previous questions that we dealt with, is to understand which particular policy is getting triggered. So they might give you an example that if I have to take the, say this one, right, renewable portfolio standard, it says that a requirement of a specific proportion of electricity generation coming from renewable sources. So they might give you an example where this particular situation, this description might get triggered, and then they will ask you to map it back to what kind of policy is exactly getting triggered here. Then you'll have to say that it's the renewable which has been enforced in this particular case. So I think reading through all the details, we'll find a lot of examples given in each one of these, but the understanding of this is much more important through all of this. it talks about the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, how it's calculated, and the data crunch that corporates or even nations might possibly be facing in it. So over here, your GHG emission accounting at the corporate level is increasingly standardized, which is mostly being done by the GHG protocol. I think whoever is into carbon accounting, emission accounting, most of us run through GHG protocol, and it's giving you a brief over here about how the GHG protocol came into play. So it was established by WRI, which is the World Resources Institute, and the World Business Council for Sustainable Development over 20 years ago, as demand for international standard for corporate GHG accounting and reporting emerged in the late 1990s. So according to the GHG protocol, 92% of Fortune 500 companies responding to the CDP use the GHG protocol directly or indirectly. And it's the world's most widely used GHG emission accounting standard. I think, again, everyone would agree that when we go for GHG accounting, GHG protocol is what we look into. Over here, so this is the place where SCR first time gives you the the terms of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, what it exactly is, and then in the future chapters it dives much more deeply into it. So to get a sense over here, I think this is the excellent diagram for exactly how the supply chain of any possible company would work. So you have the upstream activities, then you have the reporting company itself, and then the downstream activities. So this becomes a common point, and then we track it back to upstream and then downstream activities. So you have the company itself. So no matter if it's into services or into products, of course, there are things which it's doing before it's reaching to the market that needs to be accounted for in the emission trajectory, right? And then you take those products or services and then sell it back. So the upstream activities become the every process that you do to get your product ready, and the downstream activities is basically how you reach your product to the final customer. So this is the selling part of it, and this is the buying part of it. So over here you have scope 1, which is the most direct or easiest to understand scope, which is the direct emissions. So what are the direct emissions? So everything which is owned by the company itself. So you might have the company facilities, right? You might have warehouses or the office buildings or some kind of company vehicles. What are the kind of emissions that those particular facilities are making? So the reason this becomes easy is because it's under the direct operational control of the company itself. So when you talk about company facilities, right, you might have electricity bills, or if it's directly owned by the company vehicles, how much is the company vehicle traveling? It becomes very easy for you to track it down and then note it down and then assign the CO2 equivalents for it. But then we come to scope 2 emissions. Scope 2 and scope 3 emissions are kind of the indirect emissions. So in scope 2 indirect, you have the purchased electricity, steam, heating and cooling for own use.
वेलकम दादा, हो गया आपका काम?
हाँ, काम हो गया। टीवी को करना था, डिसमेंटल करके लाए थे।
हाँ,
Mute yourself. Yeah, thank you. Yes. So you have the purchased electricity, steam, heating, and cooling for own use. Now this comes from possibly your electricity bills and so on and so forth. Not that easy, but not that tough either to track down your scope 2 emissions. Then you have the scope 3 emissions. So scope 3 emissions can arise from both the upstream or the downstream activities. In your scope 3 upstream activities, you have the purchased goods and services. So these purchased goods and services is you are buying something, you're possibly outsourcing some of your raw materials or something. So then your supply chain comes into play, and how are all your suppliers from your supply chain actually getting these processes done, and then how clean or green are their own supply chains. Then you have capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, transportation and distribution. So you might have a third party who is taking care of a logistics, but then what kind of vessels so are they really using? What kind of emissions are those vessels by road or by air, by water, whatever it is. Then you have the waste generated in operation. So this is not necessarily your own waste, but this is the waste generated by your supply chain. So your third parties and your suppliers. Then you have any kind of business travels, those folks might be doing employee commute and leased assets. Then in your downstream activities, which is your, again, the selling. So all these that you were looking at upstream activities are things that you do to procure your own goods. Now that you have procured all of them, you have done some kind of processing for yourself, which is your company's thing to do. Then you also have to go and distribute it or sell it off, right? So this is where the downstream activities would come into play, and the scope 3 emissions again. So you got your products in, and now you have to get your products out. So you will again have a component of transportation and distribution. Then you will again have a component of processing of sold products, use of sold products, end of life treatment of sold products, leased assets, franchisees, and the investments that you make. So you possibly as a company are investing into another company which has its own set of activities happening. So then you'll have to look, so that becomes an indirect scope 3 emission for you. For example, today Zomato has acquired Blinkit, right? So whatever Blinkit is doing, that would kind of become the scope 3 emissions. Then over here, you have GHG emissions accounting at the corporate level. So how are these accounting being done at the corporate level? So it's kind of, it elucidates on the same diagram that we spoke about here, scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. So the standard GHG protocol standards are integrated into referenced in GHG reporting guidance prepared by different jurisdictions, including guidance produced by EU, US, and UK regulatory agencies and the international organizations. At the heart of the GHG protocol corporate standards is the concept of direct and indirect emissions, as well as scope 1, 2, 3 emissions. Direct emissions are emissions from sources that are owned or controlled by the reporting companies. So if I have to go back here, this becomes your direct or scope 1 emissions. And indirect emissions are emissions that are consequences of other activities of the reporting company, but occur at sources owned or controlled by another company. So anything across the supply chain, any kind of third-party vendors that you have, that you're doing business with or you're engaging with, all of those become an indirect or scope 2 and 3 emissions. Due to significant interest in understanding the GHG emissions associated with financial portfolios and loan books, scope 3 emissions from portfolio companies are often aggregated to compare the carbon intensity of the portfolios. So if you have to think of it for a company, for a product producing company, right, it becomes very easier to understand the concept of that they might be having some kind of emissions. But when we talk about financial institutions and they talk about going net zero, it's just in our heads it might play out as they are just dealing with money, right? They are not producing goods. They do not have a factory of their own to really go about and make some kind of emissions from. Then whereas their net zero, why are they making these net carbon neutral goals? So their such goals come from the fact that then primary business is into lending or investing into companies which would possibly have these kind of emissions. So the scope 3 emissions from portfolio companies are aggregated to compare the carbon intensity of portfolios. So that's why the portfolios become important here. So whether it be a loan book or from an investment point of view, your portfolio, how are the people you have put money into in whatever form, how are they performing on the emissions level? What kind of emissions are they doing? What kind of strategies do they have in place? This is an issue that financial institutions and data providers are grappling with. For example, MSCI uses deduplication multipliers to address double counting. They estimate the amount of would-be duplicated emissions across portfolio and adjust for it. When MSCI looks at the 12,000 companies in its master climate risk data set, it calculates a deduplication multiplier of approximately 0.205, which when applied produces an estimation closer to the actual carbon footprint. So what it's talking about in sense of duplication is, for example, if you have two companies, right, as a financial institution, you might be invested into or having have given a loan into both the supplier and the parent company itself. So when you're taking, so what is possibly scope 2 and scope 3 emission for, say, Coca-Cola, and you might have also invested into something like a Varun Beverage, which is a supplier for Coca-Cola, right? So that is scope 1 emission for Varun Beverage. But if me as Sanjini, I'm invested into both these companies and I'm adding these two emissions up, the total emissions of both Varun Beverage and Coca-Cola, then I'm actually creating a duplication. So the same emissions have been accounted for twice. So what MSCI does is it uses a deduplication multiplier of approximately 0.205. But then it also talks about why duplication is not such a bad thing. I'm not sure if it's covered in the slide, but what the text in the SCR book talks about is it's better to, so the accounting theory of being conservative comes into play, where it's okay to count it twice and just be more careful rather than having missed out on it. So emissions are further divided into 3 scopes: scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. I think we spoke about all of these. Are all indirect emissions not included in scope 2 that occur in the value chain of the reporting company, including both upstream and downstream emissions. So this again talks about what happens in scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Then we have climate risk and financial policies, sustainability and climate investment policies. So over here, this is mostly talking about the investment side of things, investment side of policies, and the various financial institutions who are actually actively moving these issues forward. So this, from a investment point of view, you have few kind of institutions. So the first thing that comes into play, and the most relevant ones, I believe, are the multilateral development banks. So the MDBs are the ones who kind of are steering this entire ESG agenda forward in a way, because they are the ones enforcing it onto multiple other organizations. So the MDBs might be investing into other funds who are investing into other funds who are investing into the last portfolio companies, right? So it's because of these MDBs that these smaller portfolio companies will have to adhere to certain standards. So when it comes to MDBs, including global ones such as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, IBRD, or more commonly known as World Bank, of course, the regional ones such as the African Development Bank, the ADB, Asian Development Bank, EIB, European Investment Bank, and the IADB, which is the Inter-American Development Bank. Now, we might think about why are we so bothered about what African banks and European banks are doing. That's because these banks also have, if we just have to take India into context, these banks, through different funds, they also have investment into our country. So if they are putting money into some funds in this country, in India, they would also be expecting the companies functioning here, or the end receiver of these monies, to actually adhere to whatever standards these guys have set. So that's why it becomes very important to understand what kind of policies or requirements do these MDBs or various kind of development banks have. So then, in addition, MDBs and other DFIs, so other DFIs become development finance institutions, are also tasked with supporting the development of the private sector. For example, the International IFC is a member of the World Bank Group, and bilateral European DFIs are part of the European Development Financial Institutions. So to take an example of an Indian DFI, if anyone has heard their name, there's NIF, which is almost like an Indian DFI, right? So whoever is invested into, or like the portfolio companies which get their money from NIF is also further invested in getting their money from such MDBs. So that's why they have to adhere to the standards kept by these, which is in a way fueling private sector's ESG actions in our country. Then we have public policy to promote adoption of green finance. Recent years of climate change has become a more prominent issue. Financial sector promotion and policy making around financial centers have started to incorporate green elements. So you might see this in various ways. You have various mutual funds which are exclusively for ESG, right? So there you might have sustainability oriented or focused investors who would want to invest into such things. Then you would also have, there are a lot of other, like there are green products such as loan products which are coming up. SBI has a specific loan product for vehicles, also more specifically for EVs. So they might give you some kind of concession in terms of interest rate. And these are not standalone, just private focused elements which are happening. These are also coming from a drive which is happening due to public policy. Then you have green taxonomies and financial regulations. So what are taxonomies? Essentially, taxonomies are just rules and regulations to follow, and financial regulations. So policymakers and regulators had not felt the need to create lists of economic activities considered green. Such green lists or taxonomies are now being created in a number of jurisdictions, including the ASEAN countries, Canada, China, EU, Malaysia, and the UK. So you must have heard of the EU taxonomy. So what it essentially does is it defines very clearly what are your green activities, what are your clean activities. So you cannot just go forward and say, just because I'm doing X and you believe it's green, that it's green. So they are standardizing what everyone's understanding of green. So that is why these taxonomies and the regulations become important. These are way of standardizing everyone's understanding of green or clean business or responsible business. So these are, okay, I won't dive into this now, but yeah. potential drawbacks arising from the use of green taxonomies. So you have this just lists out the drawbacks you could possibly have from using these taxonomies. The first one being binary green assessment. So it might standardize it and make it easier for understanding for everyone, but it might also not look upon certain things, or it might create binaries or black and white about what is green and what is not, while others might have different understanding of it. So this could go both ways. It could either lead to greenwashing, or it could also lead to exclusion of something which might actually be good for the climate. In some context, there may be shades of green. For example, depending on local and national context, as well as on the timing of the assessment. For taxonomy purposes, a green portfolio where green is deep green may be indistinguishable from a green portfolio where green is light green. So this over here is essentially talking about intensities, like we saw the hydroelectricity question, right? So it might be, for some people, it might be a great thing that's a renewable source of energy. But on the other hand, it's also causing a drought. So where exactly do you put it in the scheme of things? Then you have lobbying. The administrative process required to develop a green taxonomy may be open to lobbying and political influence. For example, following lobbying by some EU member countries and industrial associations, new technical rules on sustainable finance related by the European Commission in 2021 classified certain natural gas power plants as sustainable investment, potentially undermining the credibility of the EU taxonomy. So again, since these taxonomies are so heavily driven by socio-political understandings, this might also be subjective to lobbying. So you had 2021, this created quite a ruckus that natural gas plants are being seen as not harmful things which are happening. So yeah, it's also susceptible to lobbying. Then you have asset bubbles. So this essentially is just everyone going and saying that we are very green because we are following the taxonomy and we have done things as per it. Over time, a green taxonomy could artificially inflate the value of assets labeled green, potentially creating financial stability risks. So this is just talking about greenwashing, and that the fact that just because you are coming under the umbrella of something, your underlying financials might not be as strong, right? So just being green does not help. You also need to, your way of producing the profits need to be green and not just being green, because the objective here is not for profit. It is very much for profit. Then you have suboptimal targeting. So incentives based on a green taxonomy could benefit not only investors in new green assets, but also owners of green assets already created, which were already considered to be profitable at the time of investment. And then you have decreased quality. Green taxonomies may encourage institutions to just buy the label without properly assessing the underlying economic activities and cash flows of the investment. So another example might be like the mutual fund example, where I say I'm buying into an ESG mutual fund, right? Just because it says ESG or green or whatever it is, I buy into it. But I might be trusting the asset managers there to believe that, yes, whatever they have invested into is actually green. But unless and until someone is actually looking into it, what I'm doing is just buying the label, and which might possibly decrease the quality of the investment that I make, both from a consciousness point of view and the financial gains I make out of it point of view. Then we have the climate risk and financial supervision. So who are the ones who are actually creating these kind of, it's more from a banking point of view. What we discussed till now was the investments, so those were the AUMs or the investors that we were talking about. Here it's more bank-led, or here we might be talking more about from a loan or like accounts point of view. In just 5 years, from 2015 to 2020, central banks largely incorporated climate change into their supervision practices. In this, they followed the lead of the Bank of England, the UK Central Bank, and the financial regulator, which in 2014 was widely recognized as the first central bank to begin working on these issues, which are climate-related issues. An important subsequent initiative bringing together central banks and regulators to work on climate integration and helping to spread best practices has been the network for greening the financial systems. So the NGFS is basically a lot of countries, central banks coming together to create some kind of climate to sustainability related standards. And even RBI is part of NGFS. I think they signed up to NGFS in 2021. I don't think the book mentions it, but I think good for everyone to know. It promotes the collaboration and sharing of expertise on climate risk among supervisory institutions. It was founded by 3 European central banks, those of the UK, France, and Netherlands, but the network now counts 89 members from all continents. Central banks and financial supervisions have moved to integrate climate change both into microprudential supervision, the oversight of specific financial institutions, usually bank and insurance, and macroprudential supervision, which examines the stability of the broader financial system. Some have even moved to incorporate climate issues into traditional monetary policies through this, though this practice is still limited. So microprudential is talking about more from the sense of what particular banks or insurers might be doing, but macroprudentials are again from a policy point of view, what they are doing. Policy enforcement of sustainable investment and disclosures. So greenwashing becomes a big topic there then. Greenwashing, that is marketing that portrays products or activities as producing positive environmental outcomes, when this is not actually the case. Then we have the private sector and their climate risk frameworks. Yes. So this is where the TNFD comes into play. In the last chapter, we were talking about TCFD, which is Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Here we are talking about the nature-related financial disclosures. So since TCFD is still newer in nature, this was not part of the 22 book, but it's been added to this one. So here it gives us the framework of what's exactly happening in it. And it's like important to note that it will adopt the 4 pillars of the TCFD. So as we discussed, TCFD works on 4 pillars, which is the governance, strategy, risk management metrics, and targets. So TCFD requires you to disclose on these pillars. So does TNFD. The only difference being TCFD is more oriented to climate related disclosures, but this talks about nature related, which comes into play from nature and biodiversity related impacts one might be having. So what it says is this is to avoid repetition.
Hey, Sejini, one point that TNFD's version 4 has been introduced. So please read it once, because I think they might ask you about LEAF framework, which is developed for the TNFD, but the metrics are same. These 4 pillars are same, just that little bit differences there. So they might add questions on this. That someone told me about this, that's why.
Sure, thanks, Pratiksha. So yeah, the only difference between the two is that is climate related. So of course, you'll have more noise about emissions and carbon and such. Over here, they'll talk about the nature related impacts of your business. So yes, broader societal implications and conclusions. So reviewing policies formulated at... Yeah.
So one question. So there will be definitely 1-2 question asked on TFCD, right? In coming exams.
I don't
Expected.
know. I mean, of course. TCFD was a very important part of the exam in 22. So TNFD being added, I'm sure you can expect questions from you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So reviewing policies formulated at international summits and at the national level by governments and regulators may make policies sound like a top-down affair. But on the issue of climate change, corporate and financial norms have changed, as have societal and cultural ones. So over here, this talks about the entire grouping of how various institutions are present, the nature of their members, and the description for it. What exactly is the objective of having formed these groupings in the first place? So you have the TCFD, the SBTI we were talking about during net zero discussion. And then you have the IIGCCC, which is the Institutional Investors Group for Climate Change, Climate Action 100 plus, Net Zero Asset Managers Initiative, Net Zero. Okay, so this is for, I think this is an error over here. So asset owners initiatives, and then this will be asset managers initiatives, because these two are different ones. Then you have the Net Zero Banking Alliance, Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. So again, this is a very important part of the book, where they ask you, they might give you a description of some kind of institution that they are doing XYZ. They have so many $1 trillion in assets. This is what their objective is, and this is what they want to get going. And then they will ask you, what kind of institution do you think they should sign up into? So they might go ahead and say that I'm a bank, they does something, they want to align themselves to a 1.5 degree scenario. Then you have to identify for yourself which one of these groupings should they sign up to. So in that sense, one of the more relevant ones would be Net Zero Banking Alliance, since it's a banking organization and they want to sign up to a 1.5 degree scenario, work to a 1.5 degree scenario. So this table becomes very important. And again, just may not related just to this topic, but then all the little boxes and corners that you find on your book, the case studies, those gray boxes, whatever it is, just read through them very carefully, because they do love to talk. Because first of all, the entire exam is case study based, right? So how they elucidate on the case studies, how are they analyzing it? So even right now, when we saw the questions, all the answers seem correct, but there is a very specific way in which they want you to analyze it to reach to the correct solution. So to go through the case studies which are there in the book and seeing how they are analyzing those case studies will actually help you in understanding how to analyze the case studies which pop up in the question, in the exam. Yeah. So going forward, it is likely that the bottom-up popular societal and consumer pressure combined with lateral pressure from some stakeholders, for example, large investors, will continue to spur even tighter and more ambitious policy frameworks. So you had the likes of the EU taxonomies, which are a top-down approach, but all of these are an example of bottoms-up approach where private players have actually aggregated themselves with certain ambitions and goals, and they are working towards it. So this just talks about how there is climate action being taken in the financial space, both from a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. Yes, a global development institution. Okay, wait, these are questions. I think we are done.
Yeah. I know you were into. Okay, so we have like 17 participants. Do you guys want to do a breakout room, or is it fine that we should go with the whole pool of people and question answer?
I think we can do it as one group, because in any case, not more than 1 or 2 people are participating at a time. Others are learning in any case. So,
Okay,
go ahead. That's my suggestion if others are okay.
No, I think I will be going with your thing only because yesterday the participants were not talking. That's what I got to know. So let's have this 31 question from last year. Question said. Anyone wants to contribute?
Do you want me to read it?
No. Like just tell the answer.
Okay, just a minute.
Asta is mentioning the answer would be A.
Pratisha, just a suggestion. Whenever we are putting a new question, somebody can read it so that.
Okay, I will do that.
Answer should be A.
But for next.
My opinion is B.
Not B, because Paris is not legally binding treaty. Kyoto is legally binding treaty. It's clear, and Paris is more focused on the peer pressure, not legal binding. Kyoto was totally focused on legal binding treaty. There's no any peer pressure.
Yeah, you're right. So answer is A. What Asta
So option number A would be the answer.
Okay.
So you need to really read that Paris Agreement line that it is legally binding or not. But yeah, let's move ahead. So 32 question. A metal and mining company operates in region that recently announced new carbon pricing regulations. The company establishes a sustainability committee that will focus on reporting emissions and understanding decarbonization pathways. The director of the committee prepares for a risk mitigation strategy meeting by outlining the benefits and drawback of carbon pricing. Huh?
Question is not there in the screen.
Here's the question.
It is there.
It is there.
In a screen, it's 31.
Can you see the screen now, Srini ji?
Yes, yes.
So it is a metal and mining company which operates in a region that recently announced carbon pricing. And company established sustainability committee, and they wanted to report on emission and understanding decarbonization pathway. So the director of the committee prepares for risk mitigation strategy meeting by outlining the benefit and drawback of carbon pricing policy. Which of the following is correct for the director to include in the outline? Carbon taxes provide certainty for companies to make longer term investment decisions since the government cannot change the level of carbon tax once a time frame is specified. Again, the B is carbon taxes sometimes cause volatile carbon pricing since external shocks such as financial crisis can lead to high tax level increases that decrease the incentive to the reduce emissions. Yeah.
The answer should
Sorry, my internet is unstable. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, emission trading schemes allow sectors that are more effective in reducing emissions to sell excess permits to sector where emission reduction are technology infeasible with the current technology, and emission trading schemes are unable to create cash flows to facilitate large and long-term investment decisions since permits tend to be broad. We need to understand this schemes system first. I don't know the answer of this, but I'll tell you the answer.
is the correct definition, but B or C is the correct definition of carbon tax and investment trading. But they're asking, they are preparing the risk mitigation strategy, and they wanted to include the risk mitigation analysis in your their policy. So I think carbon B must be aware that if you are implementing carbon tax, must be aware that maybe carbon external shock may be happen and they may volatile market, and they can decrease the incentive to reduce emission. But
Sir, why not A? A also seems correct.
carbon tax provides a certainty for company to make a longer term investment. No. It's, how the make investment? The carbon tax is imposed on the company. Company has to pay a certain amount of tax to the government. So in
but it's a long term, right? If the target they won't set target for 1 or 2 years that you control the
carbon tax can be tweaked, can be changed over the times in the depends on the situation.
So for example, this carbon neutrality, we have got a long term target of 2030. It's not a 1 year, 2 year.
Hey,
so the companies
depend, but carbon tax depending on the situation, maybe it's a volatile. It's not a fixed that tax that every time they will ask. So companies cannot make the long term investment plan.
No, for example, if I'm an oil and gas company, now I know that it's like carbon emission hota hai. So it will be long term. I cannot pay taxes like 50% this year, then next year again. So gradually it will come down. It's a long term, right?
Someshwar, so if you look at the text, right, there is a section called the pros and cons that we went through. These carbon trade scheme and the carbon tax scheme. So one of the cons in there is that the carbon taxes are volatile. They can change. It's not.
Oh, okay.
standard.
हाँ
So
जी
it's mentioned in the text that the government may change the carbon taxes, the percentages over a period of time. So over here it becomes difficult to take the long-term decisions.
okay okay
So that is why that becomes a correct
okay
answer.
Taxes is
Thank you.
always fluctuable. It's not a fixed.
Yeah.
Any tax.
Any tax. Right.
Okay.
So it's not from a company point of view, but it's from the government point of view that they might edit it.
हाँ जी if government changes then they may change the tax also. Possible.
Okay.
That's why that's the reason that second option is created. That's a volatile carbon pricing. Since the external shocks and as a financial crisis can lead to the higher tax level in cases that decrease the incentive to reduce emission. Answer.
Okay.
But the answer C is also seems correct.
The answer is C. The explanation
C.
is, huh?
C is I think correct.
Yeah, even I am not aware about this question. But yeah, this is the last question. So let's wrap it up.
What is the answer for this question?
Answer is C. The reason behind it is emission trading schemes can allow industries or sector that are more successful in reducing emissions to sell excess permits to those in sectors where emission reduction are much more expensive or even technology infeasible with the current technologies. This one.
Yeah. But, yeah. It should be club B and C. But they are asking for benefits and drawbacks. Both.
The answer
C
is
is the benefits, definitely.
Yeah, I think we need to learn the illustrate the carbon pricing policy wala learning objective to get the answer. Okay, the last question for today, guys, and let's wrap it up. A mutual fund analyst transitions to a new client base with the sustainability and ESG focus. To better serve clients and understand sustainability strategy, the analyst researches the context and issues of global climate policy evolution. Which global climate policy issue should the analyst identify as correct? First is scientific evidence that human caused GHG emission warmed the planet's climate did not reach consensus until late 1990s, which explains the difficult and slow moving nature of global climate policy. So B is once human caused GHG emission were recognized as fact, academics and policymakers calculated the optimal level of emission reduction that is still accurately embedded in the current global climate policy initiatives. C is global climate policy of the last decade has been shaped by the understanding.
Answer is D.
Yeah, Chandan sir, give us all some time.
Answer. Because answer should be.
Collective action is an inherent problem. Hey, my internet is really unstable today.
So the question, 2-3 things maybe you could just suggest as tips. One is, should we really think beyond what the question is put up? Say, for example, there's this comment about, we know that in 2030, 2050, we have, a lot of companies, pursuing this. So is that information relevant to that specific question that we answered last time? I think the point is how much of the answer can be answered from what is put in the question versus how much of the answer requires you to have information beyond the question. I think that is always the trickiest part.
Yeah, so I think it is.
So I know state-wise there is, but maybe in Europe or US could be city-wise because they have got their own municipal corporation.
I read somewhere question in case study, not recalling that. That's why I asked.
Maybe California, Miami, they are more prone to climate changes, and they have got their own municipal, which is different from their state.
Pratisha, you're back.
And all these multilateral development banks and the financial institutions, based on the parameter of double method, like the profits, making profits, and also the invest in the socio-economic.
I didn't get you, Chandan. Like, are you asking like what are the motivations?
Yeah, I'm just asking that these multilateral development bank that we discussed there.
Right.
This all is the basis on the focus of the parameter. What is the basis? Because we understand in sustainability that there is a three bottom line. Okay,
right.
For the corporate sector. But
right.
what about the development sector, bank, development finance institution, MDB? Those are the double bottom line, I think.
So MDB is a very much for profit institutions, just that they put their objective is profit with purpose. So yes, triple bottom lines.
Yeah, the answer is then the answer should be D, because I think the evidence, scientific evidence of human cause was established before the GSZ protocol came. I think it was the 1980. 1980, scientific has established the confidence of women is responsible for causing GSZ emission. Okay, 1980 and 1990 is the GSZ protocol scheme. So first answer we can eliminate, in my opinion. And second option, once women cause is GSZ emission recognize the fact academics and policymakers calculate the optimal level of emission reduction that is still accurately embedded in current global climate policies. I think it's already established in Paris.
The answer is D, Chandan sir. Right, because it does. Okay, so shall we wrap up? And we have only 12 participants left. And thank you so much for being, still being there at the end. And thank you so much, Sinjini. It was wonderful learning.
Yeah. Thank you so much. And really, President, you read all the entire text. I was feeling that in between the text that somebody can read the text. You read entire text.
Thank you so much, everyone. It was great having, and I really enjoyed our discussions.
Yeah, cool. So yeah, I'll end the session. Thank you, Sinjini, and thank you, everyone. Bye.
Yeah, thank you, Sanjani, for sharing your knowledge. It was very insightful, actually. I had
Thank you
lot of doubts which actually you cleared.
So thank you so much, Someshwar. And I'm always available if you want to connect on LinkedIn or something. If we can always have a chat.
Hanji, definitely.
Sure.
And maybe I will check with my company if we can become a guest lecturer or something. Then yeah, I will definitely check with my organization.
Okay. Thank you, Someshwar sir. Bye. Bye, everyone.
Bye. Thank you all. Thanks.
Thank you.